Far out in the Caribbean, between familiar names on the map, sits a pale ring of limestone that belongs to the United States and yet welcomes almost no one. Cliffs fall straight to the sea, waves braid themselves into white lace at the base, then unspool into deep blue again. It is a place that asks to be left alone, and is. Hello, and a warm welcome to the Sleepy Geographer. Tonight's journey drifts to that quiet island, and the gentle puzzle of why America owns an island almost no one can visit. Where are you watching from this evening? Curled up on a sofa, tucked beneath a duvet, or listening to the soft hum of a late-night train? If this kind of unhurried geography helps the day loosen its grip, please tap like and subscribe. It makes a surprising difference. And to everyone already subscribed, thank you for being the kind of travellers who carry silence as lightly as a map. A small wish before we set off. May this story be just interesting enough to meet you at the edge of sleep, yet not so interesting that it chases sleep away. If it does keep you awake a little, at least the mind might drift off, having learned something gentle and true. So how did a tiny cliff-ringed outcrop become American soil, and why does the gate remain quietly closed? Begin with a map in your mind. The water is warm, shipping lanes thread through the windward passage, and storms wander by on their own schedules. In that wide blue, imagine a stone table lifted from the seafloor, its edges chipped by waves into vertical walls. No harbour, no river, no village lights to wink back. Only a lighthouse that once kept watch, and seabirds that still do. Geography gives the first answers. Sheer limestone makes approaches difficult. Swell grips the base of the cliffs like a patient hand. Currents knit and unknit themselves along the rim. Even on a calm day, a small boat must bargain with surge, timing and nerve. From the air, the island looks close enough to touch. From the sea, it keeps its distance. History steps in quietly after the waves. In the 19th century, the world discovered that old bird colonies left behind a treasure no jeweller could sell, but every farmer could use. Guano, sun-dried, wind-hardened, rich with the elements that wake tired soils, became a global commodity. Laws were written that allowed citizens of the United States to claim remote, uninhabited guano-bearing islands for their country. Paperwork travelled faster than sailcloth, and a handful of hard places on the ocean's skin suddenly mattered to distant markets. Work followed law, camps rose on the rock, heat pressed down, water arrived by ship, supplies arrived by ship, everything arrived by ship except the stone underfoot, which offered only cliffs, scrub, and the smell of salt. The rhythms were simple and exhausting. In such conditions, tempers can spark as quickly as tinder in a dry wind. When conflict came, courts far away were asked to decide what jurisdiction even meant for a lonely island surrounded by blue. That legal turning point set the pattern that remains. The island stayed under American administration. The guano rush receded as soils learned new tricks and fertilizers changed. The lighthouse era flickered and dimmed. What industry abandoned, seabirds and coral slowly reclaimed. In time, the island became a refuge, literally and by designation, guarded not by walls but by policy, prudence, and the plain difficulty of coming ashore. Tonight's journey traces that arc in a slow, steady line. The rock will be described gently, from its limestone bones to the white noise at its edges. The legal story will be told clearly without hurry. The human chapters, the work, the lighthouse keepers, the rare visitors who arrive with notebooks and leave with lighter footprints, will be held with care. And the present day will be explained as it is, not a conspiracy or a secret base, but a quiet agreement between risk and respect. Along the way, other places will appear like distant buoys, small islands with their own reasons for being off-limits. They will help place this one in context, the the way a constellation helps the eye find a single star. By the end, the map will feel more complete and the silence more meaningful. Settle in. The island waits, unchanged by screens and schedules, ringed by surf, rich in birds, held by law, and visited mostly by wind and light. The question rests softly in the mind. When is it wiser and kinder to let a place remain a distant shore? Draw the Caribbean in your mind as a broad blue basin ringed by tall green islands. To the northwest lie Cuba and the Bahamian banks. To the southeast the Lesser Antilles make a graceful arc. Between Haiti and Jamaica runs a busy marine doorway, the Windward Passage and the Jamaica Channel, together funneling ships that travel between the open Atlantic and the lanes that eventually lead toward the Panama Canal. Just south of that watery thoroughfare sits something easy to miss if you blink. A pale, cliff-edged oval called Navassa Island. It is American soil, but it feels more like a stone left on the lip of the sea by time itself. From above, the shape looks tidy, like a tabletop set down and forgotten, yet the edges are anything but gentle. The shoreline is mostly vertical, a high ring of limestone with only a few interruptions where the rock relents enough to let a wave climb a little farther. The sea is brilliantly clear, then suddenly deep, the colour slipping from turquoise to indigo in a few strokes. Ships pass within sight, but they pass on because everything about this place announces that it prefers its own company. Scale helps make sense of it. Navassa measures about 2.1 square miles, roughly 5.4 square kilometres. That is small enough to imagine circling on foot in a morning if it were a meadow, yet the island is no meadow, and the cliffs would quickly end any ambitious stroll. Think of a compact town without roads, or a city park multiplied a few times and then lifted out of the water as a plateau. The proportions are modest, the personality is not. Set Navassa among its neighbours and the map becomes more human. To the east, Haiti's Tiburon Peninsula reaches out like a long thumb. To the west, Jamaica's mountains rise from their own ring of reef and surf. Navassa sits between them and below most travel routes, close enough for line of sight on a very clear day from high ground, but separated by currents and swell that keep it solitary. It is one of those islands you do not come across by accident. It does not lure in the casual sailor. It does not promise a beach bar, a town square, or even a soft landing. The edge is all. Much of the coastline is a sheer face, in places rising over 200 feet, with wave-cut notches, spray-polished ledges, and occasional blowholes where the sea finds a seam and lets its breath roar up into sunlight. The rock steps down underwater in terraces crusted with coral, then drops into blue. Where the rim dips lower, you might find a pocket of shingle or a sloping shelf, but nothing you would call a safe harbour. Surge works like a slow, muscular hand at the base of the walls, making every approach a conversation you must conduct on the sea's terms. Because the island stands in the path of moving water, the surface often looks lively even when winds are moderate. Currents thread around the corners, eddies form and fade with passing weather, swell wraps and collides in lacework patterns only the birds seem to read instinctively. The big lanes nearby carry tankers and container ships that plan their routes with satellite precision, but small craft consider the human scale of things. Can you time the set of the swell to slip a dinghy onto a ledge and jump clear? Can you retreat just as neatly if the ocean changes its mind? Many choose, wisely, not to try. From the air, the geometry stands out. The island's centre is higher, a gently undulating table, whose thin soils host a tough, low vegetation mosaic. Dry forest, scrub, and thorn that knows how to survive wind, salt, and sun. There is no river to scribe a valley to the sea, no lagoon to offer a mirror, no mangrove to soften the boundary. Everything tends toward edges and plateaus, a place designed by uplift and erosion to be more vertical than horizontal. Despite that seriousness, there is a kind of quiet charm in how completely Navassa is itself. The light is extraordinary. Morning sun glances off the limestone until it looks almost white. At noon the plateau blazes. In late afternoon the cliffs throw long purple shadows across the water, and the reef crest becomes a bright necklace of foam. Frigate birds tilt like kites at the margin of the updrafts. Tropic birds carve their calligraphy against the sky. The island wears no cosmetics and needs none. For a geographer, location is not just coordinates on a chart, it is relationships. Navassa's relationship to the Windward Passage matters because that channel is a main door between the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Weather sweeping in from the east can wake the sea all around it. Swell generated far away can arrive with long, patient energy and spend itself at the cliff base in a continuous shudder you can feel through your feet. Even calm spells ask for alertness. Where there is no harbour, there is no casual pause. In a world full of inviting bays, this is emphatically not one, which is part of the point. The island endures precisely because it is difficult. Difficulty reduces footprints. Reduced footprints give birds and corals room. Room keeps the place more itself. That is not a romantic gloss, just a practical observation one can read from the map and the shoreline. And then there is the almost comic honesty of the island's posture. It does not flirt. It does not beckon. It stands. If it had a personality, it might be the friend who prefers a quiet corner at a party, nods politely, and declines loud adventures. As one might say with a smile, it is the kind of island that says "admire me" from a respectful distance. All of this, the placement between Haiti and Jamaica, the proximity to great shipping routes, the tiny area, the tall rim, explains why most people will only ever see Navassa in photographs, on charts, or from a careful flyover. It is not unfriendly. It is simply precise about its boundaries. The geography draws them in stone. Put your fingertip on the map and you can feel those boundaries even in the imagination. Warm water, moving air, hard limestone, thin soil, sheer edges. A dot, yes, but a dot that anchors a surprising amount of meaning about coasts, currents, and the agreements living things make with tough places. It invites curiosity, and then it puts you on notice. Approach thoughtfully. Maps answer the where, and shorelines hint at the how. The next natural curiosity rises like a small, patient question at the back of the mind. What is this island made of? Begin with the stone itself. Navassa is built from ancient reef, a thick blanket of calcium carbonate laid down when corals, algae, and shell-making creatures turned seawater into architecture. Layer upon layer, a submarine terrace grew. Then, over long stretches of time, the crust beneath shifted and lifted that terrace into daylight. What now looks like a pale table above the waves was once a living platform under them. You can still read that origin in the rock. Bands of fossil coral heads, stubby tubes of old worms, and the fine, sugary texture of compacted shell fragments turned to limestone. Rain, warm and faintly acidic from its dance with carbon dioxide in the air, is the patient sculptor of this kind of stone. Each drop is a tiny chemist, dissolving a whisper of carbonate as it travels through cracks and pores. Over centuries, those whispers become sentences the rock cannot ignore. Little runnels deepen, fissures widen. The land swallows its own edges in places, creating the familiar language of karst, sinkholes, pockets, and tight slots that lead to hidden rooms. Where the water table once breathed with sea level, caves could grow horizontally. Where gravity insisted, shafts could plunge downward, tape measured by darkness and the occasional startled bat. Now bring the ocean back to meet that lifted reef, and a second sculptor arrives with heavier tools. Waves work by persistence. They do not need to be dramatic to be effective. A steady swell, season after season, can chew a clean horizontal notch into a cliff at the level where the water hammers most often. Walk along the rim, and you may see those wave-cut notches as shadowed lines under the lip, a geological memory of the sea's preferred height at particular times. Step back, and the entire island looks like a stack of subtle terraces. Part of the lesson of limestone is that the present shoreline is just the latest sentence written in a very long paragraph. Context helps. The rim of Navassa rises in places to around 80 metres, about 260 feet, high enough that from a small boat the walls feel imposing, and from the top the drop makes even steady legs hesitate. Verticality is the rule rather than the exception. Instead of beaches that throw an arm around the sea, there are faces that meet it with a straight spine. The island gives very little away at the edges. Where the rock is jointed, the partnership between fresh water from above and salt water from below can create galleries. Some are dry chambers inland, others open at the coast as gaping mouths. Blowholes form where tunnels connect to the surge, turning narrow vents into geysers of spray when the swell and seabed pulse in unison. The soundtrack is slow percussion. Thud, sigh, thud again, as if the sea were pressing an ear to the stone and listening to its own heartbeat. On a still, hot day, the vapour drift from those breaths hangs in the air and catches the light, while heat lifts into shimmering veils across the pale surface. All of this beauty carries a practical message for mariners. Sheer walls concentrate energy. Even modest swell becomes forceful where it has no beach to spend itself on. A cove can shelter a dinghy, a cliff cannot. The wave-cut notches that delight geologists are at exactly the height where a hull might be lifted and slapped against rock. A narrow ledge that looks promising from offshore often leads nowhere, or worse, to a cul-de-sac where retreat requires timing to a heartbeat. In caves, surge rebounds and crosses itself, making a chop that undoes balance. People who know such coastlines learn quickly that landing can be a misnomer. What is possible in theory is rarely wise in practice. The surface speaks the same language of caution. Limestone is deceptively hard underfoot, and yet dissolves into treachery on a small scale. Crumbly edges, pockets that twist ankles, sharp crusts of old coral that will happily introduce themselves to your shins. Thin soils collect in swales and shallow basins, feeding a tight, thorny vegetation that grips the stone. After rain, water vanishes fast through the bedrock's plumbing, leaving the plateau bright and dry again, brilliant enough at noon to squint the eyes. Stand at the rim and look down, and you can trace time in textures. There are ledges where waves once lingered and sculpted scalloped overhangs. There are fresh breaks where rockfalls have added new blocks to the boulder fields below. There are neat benches cut at heights that match known pauses in sea level across the region. Much later, corals colonize the underwater steps again, so the island wears successive generations of reef, old lithified skeletons up high, living gardens in the blue below, and between them a moving line of energy that never quite rests. Caster landscapes often inspire poets and potholers alike, but here the romance is understated. This is reef rock doing what reef rock does when lifted and left to weather in a warm, salty world. The result is simple and striking. A ring of stone girded with notches, punctured by caves, trimmed by a narrow apron of submarine terraces. The cliffs concentrate wind into updrafts that seabirds ride with ease. The plateau stores heat like a pale anvil and releases it in faint wavering curtains as afternoon leans toward evening. It is tempting to imagine dramatic origins, but the truth is quieter. There is no volcano here insisting on attention, no river spilling sediment into a crescent bay. Slow uplift, steadier still dissolution. and the metronome of waves wrote this island into its current shape. That steadiness is why it feels so composed. Every angle has been negotiated over long time. Every notch is a treaty between sea and stone. For small boats, the message is clear even if you never learned the vocabulary of cast. The sheer walls are gatekeepers. They do not glare, they simply hold their line. If you approach, you listen to the set of the swell, measure the period between larger waves, watch how the backwash returns across jagged boulders, and gauge whether the long white lines along the rim are thinning or thickening. Most days the answer is the same: admire from beyond the reach of the spray. The island is not unfriendly, only very clear about terms. Geology rarely feels sleepy, but here it does. The rhythms are slow enough to soothe. The surf keeps time on a drum of stone. The sun lays soft gold on the rim. The rock, made from lives that layered themselves into architecture, quietly continues to change letter by letter. Uplift and dissolution, notch and ledge, cave and terrace. Each is a syllable in the island's calm language. Water moves here with purpose. To the north and east, the Atlantic gathers long lines of energy and sends them westward as the North Equatorial Current. Portions split and thread along the Antilles, turning into the Antilles Current, and some of that flow slides through the deep gap between Cuba and Hispaniola. That gap is the Windward Passage, a doorway big enough for ocean to pour through day after day. Navassa sits just south of this moving hallway, where the Caribbean Sea catches the Atlantic's breath and turns it into steady motion. Even when the surface looks calm, the body of the sea is going somewhere. Trade winds out of the east keep a reliable push over these waters most of the year. Their constancy works on the surface like a giant hand, piling up a small but persistent wind sea atop the slower pulse of swell. In winter, cold fronts far to the north whip up long-period swells that march down from the open Atlantic, arriving here with patient strength. In late summer and early autumn, tropical systems breathe across the basin, sometimes far away and sometimes near, but always capable of sending energy that wraps around any island that stands in the way. A chart tells you where Navassa is. The sea tells you how it feels to be there. Approach the island and those broad patterns become local puzzles. Swell refracts around headlands the way light bends around a lens. Waves curve, meet themselves and stack along the cliff base. Where the bottom rises abruptly from deep water to a narrow reef terrace, waves grow taller and steeper, then spend themselves all at once against rock. There is no wide shelf to persuade the sea into gentleness. There is no lagoon to collect the energy and let it slosh out later in a more forgiving mood. The island presents a wall, and the ocean answers with a continuous percussion of white water and roar. Because there is no natural harbour, boats do not tuck in and relax. Anchoring is a challenge when depth drops from many fathoms to reef in a few boat lengths, and when any set of swell pushes a hull toward an unforgiving boundary. Even on a day that looks inviting, surge can lift a dinghy like a toy and press it against limestone. The wave-cut notch that pleases the eye is set at a height that is awkward for stepping ashore. Timing a landing demands the nerve to commit and the freedom to abandon the idea at the last moment if the rhythm changes. It is not just about the size of the waves, but about their period and direction, the angle of the ledge and the return wash that runs back out like a hidden conveyor belt. Currents add their own personality. Around isolated objects, water forms eddies and shears that shift with wind and tide. Here, a small tidal range, often on the order of 1 to 2 feet, means tides do not dominate the stage, but they still nudge the conversation. The larger actors are the regional flows and the local winds. A boat's track over the ground can differ from its heading by several degrees if a stream of water is pushing it sideways. Mariners call that set and drift, and around a cliff-ringed island. Ignoring it can put you on the wrong side of safety faster than you expect. Pilots of bigger ships respect the main lanes and give Navassa a wide berth, not because they fear the island, but because prudence is cheap compared to what granite honesty can cost. The sea offers windows, but they are never picture-perfect frames. Calm spells arrive when winds ease and swell backs down, often in the lull between winter fronts or during stable summer highs. Those are the days people imagine: glassy water, a pencil line of surf, and a chance to idle just beyond the spray. Yet even then, a long swell from a distant storm may be threading through, showing itself only every dozen or so waves. The set can be deceptive. 11 pass manageable, and then a 12th lifts higher, curls farther, and sweeps the ledge clean. Experienced hands let entire pulse trains roll through before making choices. Less experienced hands often decide that other shores sound just as interesting. Weather in the tropics loves to make exceptions. Tradewind cumulus can build into squalls that sweep over with little warning, turning an orderly sea into a brief mess of rain and disturbed air. Gusts shift direction, wave faces texture over, and visibility falls to a grey curtain. In hurricane season, even distant storms can leave their fingerprints here. A low, powerful thrum on the reef, and a sea that grows while the sky remains deceptively fair. In winter, the northers, a gift from temperate fronts, send clean, long-period lines that look lovely on satellite images and feel muscular at the base of a cliff. For divers and fish, of course, this bustle is a kind of good news. Flow brings food. Upwelling along the reef edge can cool the water a touch and deliver nutrients that kickstart plankton and feed the small animals that, in turn, feed the larger ones. Creole wrasse shimmer like confetti in a parade of current. Jacks patrol the blue edge. Turtles ride lifts of water along the stair-step terraces. The island's exposure means renewal for the submarine world, even if it means refusal for human visitors. The sea here is friendly to fish, picky about guests. Small craft face particular riddles. Without a bay to hide in, captains must think in vectors and time. Do you hover upwind and up current with a boat in gear, holding position while someone tries a look from the bow? Do you attempt a stern tie to a rock, unreliable on crumbly limestone, and trust that the surge will remain polite? Even a confident plan turns into choreography when a wave set arrives early, or the wind backs a few degrees. Good seamanship sometimes looks like a decision not to try today. It is not defeat, it is the quiet arithmetic of risk. Navigation electronics help. Modern plotters, satellite imagery, and wave models give a sense of the day's character before you leave the dock. But there is no substitute for eyes on water. You learn to read the texture of the surface, the length of the shadows on wave faces, the shape of white water feathering off the rim. You listen for the low drumbeat that betrays a bigger swell line beneath smaller wind chop. You look for birds, whose comfort and flight lines tell you where the air is rising and where turbulence reigns. The island and sea together compose a language you can learn, but they do not rush their lessons. Even from a respectful distance, the dynamics reveal themselves. On the lee side, depending on wind and swell, a smoother patch may form, only to be complicated by backwash and rapping waves that meet at angles and make a cross-hatched chop. On the windward side, spray lifts continually into sunlight, and the sound carries, a deep breath and exhale that repeats without boredom. Every edge is alive, every minute a small variation on a theme that has played for longer than memory. It is easy to romanticize this restlessness, but practicality is the truest guide. The lack of a harbour is not an inconvenience, it is a structural fact. Surge at the cliff base is not a mood, it is physics on display. Weather windows are brief gifts, and even they come wrapped in caveats. Human presence here tends to be careful, rare, and short. The sea is generous with spectacle, cautious with permission. Let the mind drift back a little. Picture the long swell lines combing past, the trade wind combing the surface the other way, the reef catching both and turning them into lace. Think of currents that never completely stop, just shift their emphasis, and of a rock that stands quietly while everything else moves around it. That is the character of the ocean in this place, active, patterned, and wholly itself. Step ashore in imagination, and the first surprise is how quickly green gives way to grey, and then back to green again. The island's interior is a mosaic of hardy plants set into thin, stony soil. Much of the floor is bare limestone, old reef lifted into sunlight, pocked and ridged like frozen surf. Where dust and fragments have had time to collect, low thickets take hold, stitched together by roots that seek water in every hairline crack. This is dry forest and scrub by necessity, leaves built small and glossy to shrug off salt, branches armed with thorns, stems that store what little rain arrives. Growth is measured in patience, not in shade. Soils are the governing rule. Centuries ago, people scraped and shoveled guano from the surface, exporting the island's richest, loosest layer into the fields of distant continents. What was left behind is a terrace of stone with pockets of life. Even now, the soil that exists is thin and alkaline, built by the slow decay of leaves and the gift of birds returning nutrients from the sea. In sheltered hollows, you can imagine sea grape and other tough coastal trees thickening into a screen. On the exposed flats, succulent pads and wiry grasses hold the line against heat and wind. Every plant looks like a lesson in restraint. The forest, where it forms, is not tall. Picture hummocks of green rising to a modest height, then bending as the trade winds comb them day after day. Between these patches the ground opens and the eye runs across pale limestone toward the opposite rim. In the right season, small flowers appear, quiet whites and yellows, drawing insects that know how to make a living in hot, bright places. Lizards bask on rock that heats quickly by midday, vanishing into crevices at the first shadow. Land crabs patrol in the cool of morning and evening, tidying the floor with their slow, deliberate appetites. The real landlords here, though, commute from the sea. Seabirds own the airspace, and in breeding seasons they come ashore with an urgency that becomes the island's main story. Ground nesters like boobies and terns claim open spaces, preferring bare patches where a parent's watchful eye can see trouble coming from a long way off. Noddies choose ledges and low shrubs, and make sturdy platforms from twigs and careful thefts. Tropic birds, with their long white streamers, tuck their nests into cavities and rock holes, using the island's karst architecture as a siding against heat and wind. Frigate birds float above, all wing and intent, and settle into the bushier thickets where their nests can grip a tangle of branches. Each group has its timetable. Some arrive when the winds are steady and food is close to the surface offshore. Others time their efforts to match the peaks of small schooling fish, driven toward the reef edge by currents. Eggs are laid in simple scrapes or baskets, and parents trade duties with military precision. One to the blue for a foraging flight, one to the white heat of the nest to shade a speckled prize. Chicks hatch into a world of glare, salt, and astonishing visibility. They learn the language of shadow and sky before they can even stand. A cloud crossing the sun changes the temperature of a downy back in an instant. A frigate bird's silhouette passes and everything holds still. Quiet matters. On islands like this, disturbance has a cost measured in lost eggs, abandoned nests, and young that falter. The colony benefits from being dull to everyone but itself. With no natural harbour to invite casual visits and policies that keep the shoreline free from crowds, the rhythm of incubation and feeding can play out with minimal interruption. When heat becomes a blanket around midday, birds pant and lift their wings to vent. When the light softens, the colony stirs as if a conductor raised a baton. Calls braid into a chorus particular to each species, short barks from terns, the hollow sounds of boobies, and the occasional rattle from tropic birds returning to their caves with a beakful of silver. Plants and birds barter quietly. Guano falls as a steady drizzle in nesting areas, feeding the thin soils with nitrogen and phosphorus, and greening the shrubs beneath. In return, shrubs give structure for nests and shelter from wind. The result is a patchwork, open ground scuffed by webbed feet and toes, then denser thickets stitched together by bird life. After rain, herbaceous plants sprint through a short window of opportunity, seed quickly, and hand the baton back to dormancy until the next cloudburst. No island today is entirely free from hitchhikers, and this one has had its share of introductions. Seeds ride in on boots or in the guts of birds and sometimes find the new stage to their liking. Tough grasses can spread along the fringes of paths or old clearings. In many places across the Caribbean, people once turned goats loose for future meals. On small islands, hooves can outpace roots, and the goats flourish at the expense of shrubs. Rodents, too, have followed ships around the world and are notorious for treating eggs as free meals. Managers treat these possibilities seriously. Surveillance, prevention, and, when necessary, removal are part of the quiet work that allows native species to keep their footing. The language used is practical rather than dramatic. Check, confirm, respond, and then return to letting the island be. Reptiles fit naturally into this spare world. Anoles and other small lizards make short work of insects in the understory and on the rock face. Their colours echo limestone and leaf, and their movements are quick flickers of decision. Bask or bolt, display or disappear. At night, geckos take a shift, combing walls and trunks with adhesive toes that turn vertical surfaces into easy roads. Their presence adds to the nocturnal economy, where every creature trades heat for darkness, and the island breathes a little deeper. In the spaces between shrubs, the ground tells patient stories. Fallen feathers gather in drifts where wind eddies. The shells of small land snails mark moist microhabitats the eye would have missed otherwise. Old guano pits become bowls that trap leaf litter and seed, a miniature version of soil making in fast forward. Tracks appear in the morning like signatures, a crab's sideways line, a lizard's zipper, a bird's three-toed hieroglyph. By afternoon, heat has erased most of them, and a new page awaits. What the island lacks is as instructive as what it holds. There are no streams, no ponds, no fresh springs that invite a crowd of species to drink. Water exists in plants, in brief puddles after showers, and in the bodies of prey returned from the sea. That scarcity shapes behaviour. Birds open their beaks to cool and face the breeze to wick heat away. Plants close stomata in the harshest hours and open them when the air is kinder. Predators time their efforts to the twilight edges of day. Survival here is a choreography of economy. Even on such a compact stage, seasons still write their accents. Trade winds moderate and then rouse. The sun hangs high and then begins its daily arc at gentler angles. The pulse of life at the colony swells, peaks and ebbs as the latest generation grows feathers and curiosity. When young birds finally step into lift and light for the first time, they carry the island with them in the sense that matters most, a map of where to return and when. From a distance, the terrestrial part of this place can look bare. Up close, it is resolute rather than empty. Dry forest and scrub have learned exactly how to exist with little. Seabirds have tuned their lives to a rock that offers nesting space in exchange for discretion. Invasives, when they try to get a foothold, meet a management plan built from quiet persistence. Life persists here by doing more with less, and by keeping rhythms that match heat, wind, and stone. Slip under the chop and the world rearranges itself into architecture. The island's limestone rim becomes a reef crest where waves comb the top and place a bright, foaming edge on the blue. Just beyond that edge, the bottom steps down in terraces. Buttresses of coral run seaward like fingers, with sandy grooves between them that carry backwash and fine grains downhill. Divers call this a spur and groove system, but it feels more like a series of rooms laid out by a patient mason. A hallway of light, a vaulted chamber under an overhang, a window looking into endless water. At the shallowest margin, the reef is made to wrestle with energy. Here live the heavyweights, thick plates of elkhorn coral that break the swells and turn them into lace, mounded brain corals with channels like careful handwriting, sturdy star corals that stack modules into apartment blocks for small lives. Sea fans stand in slow motion, angling their purple veils to the current the way a forest angles leaves to light. Sponges shoulder into the scene as well, chimneys and vases filtering gallons with the effortlessness of a heartbeat, clarifying the water one sip at a time. Follow the slope down and the cast changes. Schools of blue tang glide like a single thought. Parrotfish crunch at the substrate with tidy enthusiasm, turning old coral and algal films into white sand one bite at a time. Goatfish probe with whiskers in the grooves. Grunts line up in neat files under ledges, all facing the same way as if they had agreed on a wind that does not exist. Out along the blue edge, jacks patrol like silver punctuation marks, while the occasional barracuda hangs motionless, wearing an expression that is all angles and patience. If you're lucky, a reef shark carves past and then fades into deeper colour, unhurried and uninterested in anything except the geometry of its own route. Everywhere, light and shadow set the mood. A cloud passing overhead rewrites the room in an instant. Bright plains of sand turn to pewter and back again, while the ridges of living coral glow as if lit from within. That inner light is not a trick of imagination. Inside each coral polyp live minute algae that trade sugar for shelter. On sunny days, the economy flourishes. On overheated days, the partnership strains. Coral health here, as across the Caribbean, is a story told in temperature traces, storm tracks, grazing habits, and time. When waters run too warm for too long, corals may bleach, losing their symbiotic partners and paling to ghostly cream. Many recover if stress lifts, some do not. Disease too has swept the region in waves, reminding everyone that even stone-slow lives can face sudden tests. Isolation grants a few advantages. With almost no local pollution and very little visitor pressure, the water around this island tends to be clear and untroubled by the chronic insults that reef flats endure near busy coasts. There are fewer anchors to drag and fewer careless fins to knock a branching colony into rubble. Fishing pressure is light to absent, which means herbivores like parrotfish can keep algal growth in check, and predators grow old enough to look like themselves, big, wary, and important to the food web. The quiet shows up in fish size, in the ease with which one can see the bottom far below, and in the way corals occupy the best sites with a confidence that speaks of stability. Yet isolation also tightens certain screws. Reefs renew themselves partly by catching larvae that drift in on currents from far-off parents. In a remote corner of ocean, the supply of those wanderers can be thin. Recovery after storms or heat events then depends more heavily on the survivors already in place. If a disease reaches a secluded reef, and pathogens do not respect quiet, it may linger in a small population longer, because there are fewer new recruits to dilute its effects. The same argument holds for invaders. Lionfish, for example, have spread widely across the Caribbean, and even distant outposts have seen their neat, spiny silhouettes hovering by ledges. Removal is possible only with hands in the water. Where hands rarely go, careful monitoring stands in for intervention, and the balance leans on predators learning to include newcomers on the menu. Storms write their edits, sometimes in a single night. A strong hurricane can snap elkhorn branches and tumble boulders, stripping the top of the reef and leaving fields of fresh substrate. The wound looks harsh at first, but new life loves clean stone. Fast-growing corals and crustose algae settle. Urchins, if present in healthy numbers, graze the film into a firm, pink crust that anchors future builders. Fish return to graze and shelter. In places with reduced human stress, that sequence can move briskly, turning chaos into complexity again quicker than expected. The reef's architecture, then, is not static. It is a city always under slow construction, with neighbourhoods revitalised after storms and quiet alleys that change only by millimetres each year. Walk the rooms slowly, and the variety never runs out. In the grooves, garden eels rise like living grass blades, retreating as shadows pass. On the buttresses, fairy basslets split themselves into impossible colours and hang in scalloped shade. Cleaners set up stations where larger fish queue politely to have parasites picked away, a ritual that feels part medical, part spa day. The sandy patches host conchs and flounders disguised as nothing at all. Crabs scuttle sideways with the look of animals who have some place to be. Everything seems designed to make use of a corner, a crevice, a pattern of flow. Because people rarely tramp across these reefs, the soundscape is simple. The faint crackle of snapping shrimp, the whisper of bubbles if divers arrive for a survey, the low thunder of waves doing their work on the crest. In that relative quiet, subtle behaviours show themselves. A parrotfish wraps in a thin mucus blanket for a nap. A damselfish farms a patch of algae and charges at giants to defend it. A turtle glides up a terrace as if taking stairs two at a time and then pauses to look, just as you are looking. Conservation here is less about heroic rescue and more about restraint. Leave the reef alone, and it remembers how to be a reef. Maintain the protections that keep anchors off the coral and keep fishing pressure light, and the community keeps its full range of jobs filled. Watch, record, and share what is learned so that other places can borrow the useful parts. Protect herbivores, limit disturbance, respect water quality, and plan for heat the way one plans for storms. The message travels well even if the island does not welcome crowds. It's fair to admit the limits. No local management can soften the global forces of warming seas and rising acidity. Those are set by choices far from any reef. But at the scale of one island's skirt of coral, good habits matter. Healthier patches recover faster. Diverse communities keep more options open when the next stress sweeps through. A place that is allowed to remain itself tends to teach the same lesson over and over in different ways. Complexity is resilience wearing a beautiful face. The rooms under the island, then, are not just scenery. They are processes held in elegant shapes. Buttress, groove, terrace, wall, each busy with trade and talk among creatures that largely mind their own business, and by doing so, hold the whole together. The light moves. The fish move. The slow builders keep building. Human presence is mostly a respectful glance from beyond the surf line. So why did people once come here in numbers? Before chemical factories learned to bottle plant food, farms relied on what fields could naturally recycle: manure from barns, crop residues ploughed back into soil, and ground up bones when they could be had. That worked, but only up to a point. As populations grew and harvests were pushed harder, soils in Europe and North America tired. Wheat and maize will tell you when they are hungry. Leaves pale, stalks thin, yields fall. In the middle of the 19th century, chemistry began to explain why. Thinkers like Justus von Liebig showed that plants need particular elements. nitrogen to build proteins, phosphorus for energy and roots, potassium for balance. Feed the soil those ingredients, and it returns the favour with heavier sheaves and fuller granaries. Enter guano, an old Quechua word for the layered droppings of seabirds that roost for centuries on dry islands. Sun-baked and preserved by arid air, those deposits concentrate exactly what hungry fields crave: readily available nitrogen and phosphorus with a useful dash of trace minerals. Peruvian islands on the Pacific side of South America held troves of the stuff stacked like pale cliffs. The world discovered this treasure and went slightly mad for it. Ship after ship carried the powder across oceans, and farmers marvelled as dull soils suddenly woke up. A top dressing of guano could turn a bleak field a richer green within a season. For a generation this was a wonder. Demand did what demand does. Prices rose, export monopolies formed. Nations and entrepreneurs looked beyond Peru and asked a simple question. Where else do birds roost by the tens of thousands over long, dry years? The answer was scattered across both oceans, lonely islets, flat cays, and uplifted reefs where rain is scarce and birds are faithful. In the United States, Congress wrote a law to harness that search. The Guano Islands Act of 1856 is brief but bold. It says, in essence, that if a citizen of the United States finds a guano-bearing island not occupied and not under the legal jurisdiction of another government, that person may claim it for the United States. If the executive branch accepts the claim, the government may extend protection and law to the island for as long as the guano remains to be mined. Two features of the act mattered enormously. First, it was indifferent to distance. A dot could lie far from the mainland, and proximity to other countries did not disqualify it, so long as it was not already under someone's recognised sovereignty. Second, it was practical rather than visionary. These islands were not destined for states' rights, town squares, or permanent settlement. They were to be work sites governed enough to keep order and commerce moving. In their own dry way, the pages of the statute set up what might be called history's least glamorous gold rush. The Caribbean offered candidates. Seabirds had worked industriously for ages on rocks where rain was seasonal and soils were thin. Among those, the small, cliff-ringed island between Haiti and Jamaica stood out. Birds had nested there in great numbers, and their leavings had accumulated across flats and in hollows. In 1857, an American sea captain, often named in accounts as Peter Duncan, reported guano on the island and filed a necessary affidavit. In 1858, the United States recognized the claim under the Act and entered the island into the official list of guano islands. Paperwork, in this case, was a ship all its own. Once launched, it carried legal consequences far beyond its weight. Recognition did not end the story of who felt the island should belong to whom. Haiti, newly independent earlier in the century and asserting jurisdiction over nearby islets, regarded the rock as within its sphere by geography and history. The United States viewed the island at the time of the claim as unoccupied and unclaimed under international law as the Act understood it. On one side, proximity and local tradition. On the other, the Act's text and the practice of recognizing new claims when no settled sovereignty was acknowledged. That tension would hum in the background for years, but the practical rhythm on the ground was set by cargo and labour. Guano mining is simple in idea and exhausting in practice. Men scrape and shovel the crusted deposits into piles, bag them, and move the weight by hand to the edge of the sea. On a low sandy cay with a calm lagoon, that is hard work. On a cliff-ringed island with only a few awkward landings, it becomes a logistical puzzle soaked in sun and salt. Everything arrives by ship. Water, tools, food, timber for platforms and chutes. Everything leaves by ship. Sacks of pale fertilizer that will later dissolve into fields half a world away. The route from pit to hold might involve a tramway, a chute, or a crane perched at the very rim, all of it creaking under loads while the surge below keeps time like a drum. Markets pulled the strings. When prices were favourable and weather decent, crews expanded and output rose. When a hurricane wandered too near, or when the global price dipped, activity slackened. The labour force included men hired locally in the region and others brought from farther afield. Heat, isolation, and the hazards of moving heavy sacks near sheer drops made tempers as volatile as the surf. Overseers pushed. Workers resisted long hours and short rations. On many islands across the guano world, that recipe led to disputes. Here, it would eventually lead to a crisis that drew courts into the conversation. But at first, the focus was on tonnage and timetables, on getting the harvest of birds' chemistry off the plateau and into the holds of brigs and barks. For American agriculture, the stakes were very real. Soil fertility was the dividing line between subsistence and surplus. A reliable stream of nitrogen and phosphorus meant more bread on tables, more cotton on looms, more profit in ledgers. Guano's reign would not last forever. Chilean nitrate and later the Haber-Bosch process for fixing atmospheric nitrogen would change the game, but in the late 1850s and 1860s, a new guano source looked like an excellent idea. The Act made it straightforward to fold such places into a temporary legal umbrella so that investors would feel their risk was protected and their cargoes would not be seized as piracy or trespass. It is worth pausing on how thoroughly economics can reframe a lonely piece of geography. A decade before the claim, the island was a cliff and a reef, watched by birds and waves. A decade after, it was a node in a global supply chain, with schedules, payrolls and invoices. Charts were updated. Port agents learned a new name. Farmers who would never see the Caribbean shook coarse powder from a sack and watched as their oats and wheat leaned greener than before. Geography does not change quickly, but meaning can pivot almost overnight when demand knocks. As operations grew, the island's physical character never stopped offering its commentary. Moving men and material up and down vertical spaces expensive in sweat and dangerous in sudden ways. A misstep near a rim. A sling that gives under load. A boat that rises a foot too high on a surge at the base of a crane. Every ton off the plateau represented dozens of careful lifts and transfers. Success depended as much on seamanship as on shovels, and on patience as much as muscle. It was industry done in narrow weather windows on a rock that did not cooperate. Still, for a time, the sums worked. Birds had left centuries of value. Ships had holds to fill. Buyers had fields waiting. A law on the books gave the enterprise shape, jurisdiction, and the promise that disputes would be settled in courtrooms rather than with muskets at sea. That combination, chemistry, law, and the stubbornness of people, turned a quiet island into a workplace with a timetable. Morning began not with an alarm but with heat pushing at canvas and tin. On this cliff-ringed rock the sun was the timekeeper, and the work bell followed. Men rose from narrow cots in shacks patched from lumber brought by sea, shook dust from their clothes, and stepped into brightness that seemed to come from every direction at once. Shade was a luxury measured in handspans. Breakfast was simple and fast, washed down with water that had been counted by the barrel. Water ruled everything. There was none to draw from springs, none to ladle from a stream. Every drop arrived by boat in casks and tanks, hoisted up by block and tackle, tallied in chalk and guarded as carefully as pay. Cooks knew exactly how far a bucket must stretch in a week. Bathing was less a soak than a rinse, often skipped when the ledger of barrels said the margin was thin. Thirst kept tempers on a short rein, and the person who spilled a dipper learned quickly to move out of sight. Work itself was steady, physical, and honest in its demands. The guano lay in crusted layers across flats and in hollows, a pale harvest to be scraped, shoveled, and bagged before it could ride a chute to the waiting holds. Tools rang against rock, dust floated in the still air, turning sweat into paste. Teams rotated through tasks to keep the day from grinding one set of muscles into mutiny. One crew cut and filled, another stitched sacks and tied them shut. A third worked the tram or the crane at the rim, where the island dropped away and the sea thudded below like a slow drum. Between the pits and the edge ran paths the men wore into the stone, switchbacks marked by heel polish and the scuff of sacks. Every journey was uphill one way or the other, legs learning the island's particular rhythm by noon. At the rim, a foreman and a boatswain worked in duet. Loads lowered, loads raised, signals shouted against the surf's patient roar. A gust could twist a sling, a wave set could climb higher than expected, a coil of rope could suddenly be in the wrong place underfoot. Safety was less a rule-book than a culture of carefulness enforced by the memory of who had slipped last season and what it had cost. Supplies arrived in their own weather windows. A sail or smoke on the horizon meant a different kind of choreography. Water first, always, then crates of tinned food, sacks of rice, barrels of flour, a box of tools, bolts of canvas, medicine if the lists and the timing agreed. Mail came in small bundles, news in rumours. Sometimes a new man stepped off the boat and tried to square what he had imagined with what his hands now touched. Sometimes a man with a healed injury stepped onto the sling with a look that said he had learned the island's lesson and would try elsewhere next time. The camp felt temporary even as weeks stretched into months. Shacks sat lightly on the stone, their posts wedged into cracks or weighted with rubble. Paths moved when the wind dictated, or when a new seam of guano asked for attention. The kitchen smoke changed direction with the trades. At night, lamps made small warm islands in a darkness that was otherwise complete, except for the distant blink of the lighthouse once it was built. The island did not become a town, it remained a workplace with a short memory for improvements. Storms could reset the board overnight. Isolation worked on people in different ways. Some settled into a rhythm that suited them. Work, eat, wash, rest. A letter home on calm evenings, a game of cards under a sliver of moon, then sleep to the pulse of surf. Others found the edges closing in. The horizon was a ring that never moved. The wind wrote the same sentence day after day. Jokes wore thin. A small slight felt big by sunset. Foremen watched for those shifts because morale was the hardness that could not be ordered off a ship. A fair distribution of rations helped. So did small mercies. A longer break at midday, a replacement pair of boots, a careful word when a man's patience ran low. Pay mattered, and so did the certainty of it. When wages were late or supplies light, the arithmetic of endurance changed. Promises travelled quickly in both directions, from company to camp, and from men to each other. Some crews came with experience on other islands, and carried their own expectations of conditions and treatment. Others were new to this kind of work and learned fast that a cliff is not a good negotiating partner. On a generous day, there was time after supper to sit on a ledge well back from the rim and watch flying fish scatter like thrown coins in the last light. On a mean day, the only view was of the next sack and the next. The island's character never stopped adding commentary. Heat rose from the pale ground like breath from a sleeping animal. Wind whispered, or pressed, rarely still. Seabirds circled without hurry, calling in voices that sounded like laughter to some and like scolding to others. Crabs tested the edges of the camp at night, tapping tin and making small mysterious clatters that became stories by morning. Even the tools seemed to salt themselves with fine grit as soon as backs were turned. Health was a ledger kept in details. Sunburn was immediate. Then came cracked lips, chafed hands, eyes stung by dust. Good hats and long sleeves became treasure. Cuts needed watching in a place where salt and limestone conspire to keep wounds open. A fever could sideline a man for days and press his mates into longer shifts. When a real injury came, the kind that arrived in a heartbeat and left a silence at the mess table, there was only the boat and the distance. The sea could be generous with fair passage, or it could insist on waiting. Yet there were moments that complicated the hardship. A squall would pass and leave the air rinsed and sweet for an hour. A crate would open to reveal not just staples but a handful of oranges that tasted like laughter. A letter would arrive from home with handwriting that made a man hold the page as if it might break. On those nights, the camp felt almost companionable, a fragile village stitched together by work and the knowledge that everyone depended on everyone else. It was a hard place, but not a heartless one. Men looked out for one another because indifference was expensive. Arguments cooled when the next lift required 4 steady hands. The cook tucked a little extra into the bowl of the man who'd work the crane through the hottest hours. Foremen who remembered they were dealing with people, and not just tons, moved farther on calm seas than those who did not. Respect was not a virtue in the abstract. It was grease for the gears. The longer the operation ran, the more the balance between hardship and fairness mattered. When it tipped too far toward the first, words grew sharp, and patience snapped like old rope. On a rock with no soft edges, even small grievances could gather weight. Tension rose, and history took a legal turn. By the late 1880s, the ledger of endurance on the island had too many entries: heat that climbed early and lingered late, water doled out by the dipper, loads hauled to cliff rims where a mist of salt turned skin raw, long hours for modest pay, and the particular strain of working within sight of the sea yet living far from home. Supervisors pushed production, labourers, mostly black men hired in the region and beyond, pushed back in the only ways open to them. Small refusals, arguments over rations, appeals for rest when the sun made the ground wink with heat. The setting magnified every grievance. On a narrow, high rock, even a short temper has nowhere to go. Accounts agree on the essentials. On a September morning in 1889, tension that had been accumulating for months found a spark. A quarrel over orders and treatment became a fight. A fight became a wider clash. Stones and tools were at hand, so were fear and anger. When the island fell quiet again, 4 white supervisors were dead, and a 5th, gravely injured, would die a few days later. The labourers did not speak with one voice. Some tried to break up the violence, some fled, some were caught in the storm by proximity. But the result was undeniable and tragic. Word carried over water with the speed it always finds when disaster travels on its back. A United States warship arrived, and officers took stock with the formal, spare language of reports. Dead, wounded, statements gathered, suspects identified. 18 men were taken into custody and brought off the island for trial. Their destination was Baltimore, a city tied by commerce to the company that had organised the mining, and a federal court with jurisdiction to hear charges of murder committed on what the government regarded as United States soil by virtue of the Guano Islands Act. The trip north changed the story's backdrop but not its stakes. Newspapers in several cities covered the affair with a mix of scandal and sympathy, and often with the racial framing common to the age. Some headlines leaned toward outrage on behalf of the dead overseers. Others focused on the conditions the workers described: exhausting labour under a fierce sun, scarce water, discipline enforced with too little patience and too much force. Churches and fraternal societies took notice. The Order of Galilean Fishermen, a black fraternal organisation, helped fund a defence that would present both the human context and the legal question hanging over everything. whose law reached a guano island in the open sea. In Baltimore, the courtroom filled with a particular hush of capital cases. The prosecution's case was straightforward. Supervisors had been killed. Witnesses placed certain men at the heart of the violence. The United States had authority under the statute that made guano islands, once recognized by the president as appertaining to the country, subject to federal law. The defense did not deny that a deadly conflict had occurred, but pressed two lines hard. First, that some defendants acted in self-defense, or in the sudden heat of fear and provocation, rather than with malice aforethought. Second, that the court lacked jurisdiction. This was a remote rock outside any state near Haiti, claimed by the United States only because of a fertilizer law. Could such a place be treated as if a crime there had happened on the high seas under an American flag? The trials were painful, human, and public. Testimony conjured the camp in difficult detail. The rationing of water, the long climb with sacks, the arguments that grew barbs as the season wore on, the moment when control snapped. Jurors listened to the geography as much as to the law. Cliffs, cranes, ledges, the thud and backwash that made every task a negotiation. They also heard about race and power, because those threads ran through the fabric of labour relations in the late 19th century, no matter where the island sat. When verdicts came in, several men were convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Others received lesser sentences. The courtroom emptied, but the questions did not. Appeals followed. One of the cases that rose to national attention bore the name Henry Jones. His lawyers, among them Everett J. Waring, remembered as the first black attorney to argue before the United States Supreme Court, pressed the jurisdictional challenge alongside the particulars of Jones's role. The argument ran like this: Congress could not, by statute, transform a distant rock into a place where federal law applied as if it were a ship at sea. In any event, the island lay close to Haiti, and ought not to be treated as American for criminal purposes simply because of bird droppings and paperwork. The government answered that the Guano Islands Act had created a clear framework. When the president recognized such an island, federal statutes for offences on the high seas extended to it. Crimes committed there could be tried in the federal district into which the accused was first brought. The president had recognized the island decades earlier. The law's design was working as intended. Outside the courts, the public conversation continued. Editorials drew lines between labour and capital, between black workers and white bosses, between federal power and local intuition about place. Some writers saw the revolt as a desperate act born of mistreatment, others as murder thinly veiled by hard conditions. Ministers preached compassion and restraint. Business leaders warned about threats to order in remote enterprises. Families of the dead grieved. Families of the accused waited. In 1890, the Supreme Court spoke in Jones v. United States. The justices upheld the constitutionality of the Guano Islands Act's jurisdictional scheme and affirmed that crimes committed on recognized Guano Islands could be tried as if committed on the high seas under United States law. The holding did not settle every feeling or every argument in the street, but it settled the law. For Henry Jones and others, the immediate consequence was grim. Death sentences stood. Then another voice entered. Petitions for clemency, supported by community groups and even some jurors, reached the desk of President Benjamin Harrison. The petitions did not claim innocence so much as complexity. Terrible circumstances, a sudden break in order, and the belief that execution would not serve justice. Harrison weighed the record and commuted several death sentences to terms of imprisonment. In his message to Congress, he acknowledged both the authority of law and the hard circumstances that had shaped the event. Mercy arrived not as a revision of fact, but as an adjustment of consequence. The island, meanwhile, returned to its rhythms, the wind, the surf, the work, and the arguments about ownership that would continue at a low hum for years. The uprising did not end mining outright, though it certainly sharpened attention to conditions and costs. It did, however, etch the island into the legal map of the United States in a way that outlasted industry. A statute written to move fertilizer had pulled a tiny rock into the orbit of federal courts, and a tragedy had tested the reach of that pull. It is possible to hold all the truths at once, that supervisors died violently, that workers laboured under harsh conditions, that fear and anger can take a minute to ignite and a century to understand, that law needs borders even when geography does not provide obvious ones. The story is not tidy. It rarely is when people and power meet in hard places. Which court exactly speaks for a rock in the open sea? Courts do their work in rooms of wood and echo, but sometimes the case on the docket begins far from carpet and chandeliers. In 1890, the United States Supreme Court considered a story that started on a pale rock between Haiti and Jamaica and turned into a question with crisp edges. When Congress writes a law about distant Guano Islands, which law follows a person there, and which court has the right to speak? The statute at the centre was the Guano Islands Act of 1856. Its premise was straightforward. If a citizen of the United States discovered a guano-bearing island not occupied and not within the jurisdiction of another government, that citizen could claim it. If the president recognized the claim, the island would appertain to the United States for as long as guano was to be had, and federal law would apply to conduct there, as if it had occurred on a ship on the high seas under the nation's flag. Congress also named a practical forum. Crimes committed on such islands could be tried in the federal district into which the accused was first brought. It was legislation designed for commerce, but it carried a jurisdictional engine under the hood. After the deadly conflict on the island in 1889, the government charged several men with murder and brought them to Baltimore. Their counsel did not accept the premise that a fertilizer statute could transform a remote outcrop into a courtroom's domain. The argument pressed two themes. First, that the Act, if read to extend federal criminal law so far, gave the political branches too much power to decide where the Constitution reached. Second, that geography and proximity mattered. A rock close to Haiti should not be treated as if it were a deck plank on a United States vessel. The court approached the matter with the dry clarity that big questions often deserve. It began with Congress's authority to define and punish crimes on the high seas and in places outside the jurisdiction of any state. That power is in the Constitution's list of enumerated authorities. The Guano Islands Act, the justices reasoned, did not conjure a new planet for federal law. It created a rule for identifying a narrow class of locations, unoccupied guano-bearing islands recognized by the president, where certain statutes would apply. Recognition by the executive was not annexation. It was the trigger Congress had chosen to signal when its previously enacted laws would speak. The president's role was fact-finding and designation within bounds Congress had drawn. On that logic, the island did not have to be near or far. It had to fit the statute. The court pointed out that courts had long treated ships as travelling pieces of national territory for many legal purposes. If Congress could make murder on an American vessel triable in a district court in Maryland, then Congress could also decide that murder on a recognized guano island would be treated the same way. The phrases mattered. Appertaining to, rather than incorporated into, because they showed the limited reach intended. The justices were not blessing a general power to plant the flag anywhere and call it home. They were confirming that Congress could, for defined situations involving American enterprise and protection, arrange for law to follow citizens into practical corners of the world. The human facts did not vanish in legal reasoning. The record in the Jones case included testimony about heat, water, hours, and the spark that set violence in motion. But the Supreme Court was not retrying guilt or innocence. It was deciding which courthouse had the right to hold a trial at all. On that narrow but powerful question, the answer came down. The federal court in Baltimore had jurisdiction. The conviction and sentence in Henry Jones's case stood, subject only to mercy from the political branches. The president would later commute several sentences, acknowledging the tangled realities that the law's clean lines could not fully absorb. What did the decision change? In one sense, very little. The statute already said what Congress meant. The court said that Congress had the power to mean it. In another sense, quite a lot. The case made clear that the United States could, by statute and recognition, build legal bridges to small temporary jurisdictions tied to specific activities. It was a blueprint for handling outposts created by commerce, places never intended to be states or even permanent colonies, but still sites where crimes and contracts would arise and require a forum. The decision also clarified a vocabulary that later lawyers would return to often, words like appertainings, possession, incorporated, and unincorporated. The court did not write a grand essay on empire. That would come a decade later in cases about far larger territories. But by treating a guano island as a place where some American law could walk and some could not, the justices sketched a boundary that law would fill in over time. The ripple spread not because the rock was large, but because the principle was neat. Congress may let law follow the flag in tailored ways, and the executive may point to the map when asked, "Which places did you have in mind?" There was a practical ripple too. Investors and ship owners prefer predictability. If a worksite is covered by a known legal regime, contracts can specify obligations, insurance can be priced, and disputes can be channeled into courtrooms instead of into armed standoffs. Workers and communities, in turn, learn where to aim petitions for redress. If the mainland courts will hear you, you write to a clerk and a judge instead of to a governor who will never see your letter. The case helped both sides see the routes available to them, however imperfect those routes were in an age of slow travel and slower sympathy. A critic might say the holding made it too easy to drape far-off places in domestic law for the convenience of companies. A defender might answer that the alternative, no law at all, or a scramble among competing claims, would be worse. The truth often sat in the middle, as it did here. A statute built for guano gave the government tools to keep order, and it gave defendants, however distant from home, the full machinery of trial and appeal. It didn't solve the problem of harsh conditions at remote work sites. It did not choose a side in every moral contest. It simply drew a channel through which cases could flow. For a geographer's eye, there is a quiet oddity in it all. A limestone dot ended up drawing lines in the law. The reef rim that keeps boats off the ledge became a metaphor for jurisdictional edges. This surge that complicates landings found an echo in the surge of an argument about where a nation's voice carries. The maps in the appendix to the lawyers' briefs might have been no more than a sketch of latitude and longitude, but they were doing unusual work, turning coordinates into a key that unlocked a courthouse door. The island itself did not change because of the opinion. The wind still pushed in from the east. Birds still returned to scrape and nest in their seasons. The cliff faces kept the same habits of echo. Yet after 1890, the quiet rock had one more identity layered onto its geology and its history. It sat, not just on a shelf of limestone, but on a shelf of precedent. When later officials and judges faced questions about other small possessions, they could point back and say, "We have done something like this before." The last word in the case did not belong to judges alone. Mercy from the president softened outcomes. Time and economics thinned the guano business. The lighthouse and then conservation would bring a gentler vocabulary to the same coordinates. Law had taken its measure of the place, and then, as law often does, stepped back to let the next chapter write itself. The opinion stayed on library shelves. The island stayed in the sea. The shipping lanes that skirt this part of the Caribbean are busy with purpose. Freighters moving between the Atlantic and the Canal, tankers shaving distance through the Windward Passage, liners and mail packets pacing their schedules by the stars and the clock. Even on clear days, the sea keeps a few tricks, and on dark ones it keeps more. After the tragedies of wrecks and near misses on cliffed islands, the case for a light is always simple. In the early 20th century, engineers and crews arrived with steel, lenses, and the determined calm of the old United States lighthouse service. They set out to put a steady human eye on a stony horizon. The choice of site was both obvious and awkward. Obvious, because the island's height gave a natural pedestal. Awkward, because every strong point is reached only by climbing. First came the landing problem. Lift people and parts from small boats onto narrow ledges, while the surge muttered at your boots. Then the haul, winches, tramways, and a lot of backs moving crates upward in relays, while seabirds circled to inspect the fuss. On the rim, men bolted a skeletal tower into concrete footings, a lattice meant to flex and survive the kind of winds that find islands irresistible. The lamp housing would sit far above the plateau. A bright note hung on a cliff's-high staff. Viewed from a distance at night, a lighthouse is a simple promise. Here I am, and here is danger, and here is your fix. Up close, it is a compound of routines. Keepers tended a lens that gathered and sent a precise signature of flashes, the timing listed in books that captains could read even with one eye half asleep. They trimmed wicks or, later, checked the mantles and fuels, polished brass and wiped salt from the glass because the sea's breath travels everywhere. Every mechanism had redundancies because things break at the worst moment. A spare everything lived in a crate labelled in careful hand. Life on the plateau settled into the shape of weather. Trade winds dictated the sound around the buildings, a steady hiss punctuated by squalls. Season by season, different tasks got their day. Before a blow, loose material was lashed down and shutters checked. After a blow, the hands walked the perimeter to see what the wind had tried to borrow. Paint wore out fast on a sunlit, salt-laced ledge. Rust is a hard worker in the tropics, and the steel ribs of the tower needed an almost parental level of attention. Between chores, the keepers kept their own spirits level in the usual ways. Routine, a bit of humour, and fascination with small changes. A new clutch of eggs under a shrub, a ship whose course line they could recite from memory and still watched as if it were a new play. Supply runs knitted the far beacon to the mainland. Every few weeks a tender would nose in on the best day it could find, and the island rejoined the human world with sacks of flour, tins of kerosene, spare parts, mail, and newspapers out of date and still devoured. The landing dance reversed, bundles hoisted, barrels topped off, hands to the dinghy, a careful pull back into blue. If the weather closed, the schedule slipped and the keepers stretched stores by habit learned early. Water from cisterns counted as carefully as coins. Coffee rationed itself by good sense. Fresh fruit tasted like a holiday. Storms were the chapters everyone remembered. In a hurricane, the tower sang in a register you feel more than hear, the lattice humming like a giant tuning fork while horizontal rain wrote in slant script across every surface. Waves blew up the cliff face as white vapour. Birds vanished inland or were simply not seen at all, because nobody went outside unless essential. Afterward, the world looked scraped and rearranged, shingles torn, guy wires thrumming, the ground carpeted in salt-burned leaves that turned brittle within days, and yet, more often than not, the light had kept its rhythm and kept ships off the rock. There is a particular gratitude in that, a job that shows its value in the absence of disaster. The emotional geography of a far beacon is its own coastline. The circle of horizon becomes familiar, dawn the colour of diluted copper to the east, dusk bruised and soft to the west. You learn the regulars, freighters that appear on Tuesdays as though someone had set them carefully on a conveyor belt, liners that show a string of windows at night and sound a horn that feels like a memory. And you learn the surprises, a stray schooner out of time, a naval silhouette slipping by like a question. In quiet hours, keepers read, wrote letters, learned the personalities of clouds, and argued over whether the sea looked more blue or more green at a certain hour. Isolation can be a weight or a solace. Most days it is both, carried well. Repairs and improvisations formed a long subplot. When hardware rusted beyond forgiveness, someone machined a spacer out of something meant for another purpose. A cracked lens pane asked for extraordinary care until a replacement arrived. A rope chafed through where nobody had expected, and a new lead was rigged in an afternoon that ended with a handshake and a lie down. Engineering on a cliff can feel like a conversation with patience. You will win if you insist quietly, lose if you rush. As navigation improved and automated lights multiplied along the region's routes, the importance of a staffed station declined. The old light transitioned by stages, brighter modern optics, simpler power, then automation that reduced the need for constant human hands. Eventually the statutory keepers left, and the island exhaled the small sounds of daily routine. No more broom on steps at first light, no more clink of tools on a bench, no more laughter snatched away by wind and carried into the birds' chorus. Decommissioning arrived at last. The lantern went dark for good, replaced in charts by other aids that did the math differently. What remained on the plateau were bones, the steel frame, weathered and streaked, concrete foundations, the footprints of buildings, a water cistern, the ghost lines of pathways. From offshore you can still see the tall silhouette, a kind of exclamation mark left behind by a sentence that has finished but still matters. Even in retirement, the light story has work to do. Mariners read charts that include notes about the island's height and the hazards of no safe anchorage. The presence of a ruined tower is itself a caution in steel. Biologists, when they visit under permits, mark the structure's perches and the nests tucked where beams meet. A new use for an old geometry. Photographs taken from far above show the way the tower's shadow leans long in late afternoon, drawing a straight line over a world of curves. Memory becomes part of management. History becomes part of habitat. It is worth remembering why the light was needed in the first place. The Windward Passage and the routes around it have always concentrated traffic and attention. A high, sheer island without a harbour makes a poor neighbour for ships without a guide. The lighthouse turned a nameless danger into a named one, and then into an avoided one, by the simple courtesy of being visible and reliable. That is what lighthouses do, and in doing it here they stitched a remote coordinate into a web of human trust. When keepers went ashore for the last time, the island did not notice for long. Wind resumed its ordinary appointment with limestone. Birds reclaimed uninterrupted airspace. Rust wrote slow poems on steel. The sea, which never fully acknowledges our infrastructure, kept to its schedule and its moods. The human chapter narrowed to footnotes and fondness among those who care about lights and the people who tended them. The end of the guano years did not announce itself with trumpets. It arrived as a gradual thinning, thinner layers in the pits, thinner profits in ledgers, thinner patience for hauling heavy sacks across a sunburnt plateau. Farmers still wanted nitrogen and phosphorus, but the world was learning new tricks. Chilean nitrate shipped in bulk, then, not much later, the Haber-Bosch process taught factories to fix nitrogen from the air itself. What birds had built over centuries began to lose its price advantage in a handful of decades. The island did not change shape. but its reason for hearing so many footsteps did. Extraction slowed the way a tide falls, first subtle, then obvious. Crews shrank. The crane complained less often because it lifted fewer loads. Supply runs spread out on the calendar. Arguments about rations and hours gave way to talk about other jobs and other shores. Some equipment was hauled away, some was not worth the trouble and stayed to weather on the rim, a few bolts at a time turning to brown lace. Platforms loosened, rails buckled, and paths softened at the edges as wind and salt resumed their larger, older responsibilities. With people thinning out, the island practiced an art it had always known: quiet. Birds noticed first. Ground nesters returned to scuffed flats without having to share them with boots. Shrub tops stayed unbroken longer and so held nests better. Tropic birds slipped back into the same cast slots season after season, confident that no one would be hammering nearby. Frigate birds balanced on the crown of the scrub and surveyed a horizon that contained fewer surprises. Even the sound changed. Fewer human shouts carried on the wind, more wing beats, more conversational cries that start softly before dawn and never quite become noise. Plants took the gap as an invitation. Where tramways once scored the rock, soil began to collect again in the slight hollows and ledges. Seeds that had waited for a windbreak landed and stayed. The scrub thickened in cautious patches, each new tuft a small windbreak that helped the next take root. In a hot, dry place, greening is never dramatic, but patience is powerful. The ground that had been swept clean for work began to carry a rough living nap again. The reef below, already busy on its own schedule, gained from the reduction in grit and disturbance. Fewer anchors dropped near the crest. Fewer careless spills of anything soluble reached the water. Algae and coral continued their old negotiation over space, with grazers like parrotfish still playing referee. Recovery on a reef is not just a matter of absence, it also needs good luck with temperature and storms. But when pressure lightens on land, the whole system often seems to breathe more easily, and here it did. A lighthouse kept watch for a time, and then even that human heartbeat steadied into automation and finally into memory. The day-to-day presence of keepers dissolved. The island's soundtrack shifted back to its old instruments. Wind through thorn, heat lifting in soft veils off pale stone, the slow metronome of surf-striking steps of hidden terrace. Rust took over abandoned fittings with the tender thoroughness of a plant reclaiming a fence. On a ledger kept by the island itself, the entries now were all in the columns of weather and life. Silence, of course, is not the same as emptiness. Under permits and careful plans, scientists landed now and then to count nests, check vegetation, clear an invasive sprout, or drop a temperature logger on the reef. Their visits were short and choreographed to leave almost nothing behind. Field notes filled with words like low disturbance, high exposure, and nest density. If stories crept in, they were gentle ones. A booby that refused to move from a sunlit egg, a gecko investigating a boot, a sudden thunderhead that turned the plateau into a Quicksilver theatre for half an hour, and then wandered off to find a different audience. The island's reputation began to consolidate around a simple truth. It was better off when left alone. Sailors already knew the place as a hazard to keep at arm's length, unless weather and purpose forced a closer dance. Now, managers and conservationists added their own respectful distance. A handful of lines on a policy map expressed what the geography had always implied: no harbour, difficult approach, sensitive nesting. That policy did not create the solitude so much as protect it. The Rock was doing fine at discouraging casual company. Law provided the courtesy of making that discouragement official. Occasional talk still rose and fell about possibilities: communications equipment, a research outpost, some new idea that wanted a pedestal. Each proposal met the same patient facts: cliff surge, salt, heat. precious nesting ground that can be undone by a single thoughtless afternoon. The calculus always favoured caution, not a grand, theatrical caution, just the kind that counts birds and asks quietly whether a project belongs on another islet with gentler edges and fewer wings. Stories filtered into ports and towns along the Caribbean rim, a place that used to ship away thousands of sacks of pale fertilizer now shipped out nothing at all. A place where men once watched the horizon to see if the tender would come, now watch the horizon for weather only. A place where human calls had been part of every day, now filled its hours with turned chatter and the low gossip of boobies. Reputation, like soil here, builds from small deposits. Navassa's name in conversation began to gather adjectives that suit sanctuaries: hard to reach, delicate, worth protecting, best admired from distance. There is a particular power in not being busy. Many islands bear heavy stories: wars, fortresses, ports, plantations, recoveries. This one, after a hard interlude of industry, slid back toward a quieter baseline. The drama now is seabirds raising the next generation under a sky that rarely looks the same for more than 10 minutes. The spectacle is colour: indigo water shouldered with white at the rim, the pale blaze of limestone at noon, the cloud that throws a moving lake of shade across the plateau. The only schedule that matters is the trade winds. The only ledger that counts day in, day out is the tally of chicks that fledge and return years later, to claim their own handspan of ground. If you look for human fingerprints, you see them, but faint. Concrete foundations linger like captions to a long-closed chapter. The tower silhouette remains a reminder that even a warning can become a perch. The paths are still visible in places where shoes once taught the stone to be a little smoother. And the law, the same habit of rule-making that once invited mining, now serves a different appetite, the appetite for green and blue to proceed without interference, for cliffs to keep their sharpness, for nests to be ordinary events rather than news. There is kindness in deciding that a stubborn place should not be persuaded into being hospitable. That decision did not come from a single moment. It rose from experience. Ships learned to steer wide. Administrators learned to say no with a smile. Scientists learned to count quickly and step lightly. The island learned nothing. It already knew how to be itself. What remains is a kind of lesson you can sit with. Extraction can be a phase, not a fate. Quiet can be a resource as real as any ore. Leaving space alone is not a failure of imagination. It is a disciplined choice to let other lives carry on without constant negotiation with ours. If the world had a few more places like this, a few more stubborn dots that enforce respectful distance, our maps would not be poorer for it. Ask a map a simple question: who owns that little cliff-ringed island? And the answer comes back in layers. On paper and in practice today, the United States administers the place. The legal doorway was opened in the 19th century under the Guano Islands Act, recognised at the national level and reinforced in court decisions that treated the island as a location where specific federal laws apply. In the present day, it sits within a network of federal stewardship. Wildlife professionals hold the keys, access is by permit, and the ordinary visitor is kindly told to admire from offshore. Haiti, for its part, has long maintained that the rock it calls La Navassa belongs within its national family of islands. Haitian constitutions have named nearby islets as part of the national territory. Haitian maps and school books have kept the label alive. Haitian governments across generations have stated the claim with a consistency that counts for a great deal in international life. Geography lends Haiti's position an intuitive appeal. Look west from Haiti's Tiburon Peninsula, and the island sits close. A pale stone in a blue bowl that Haitian fishers have crossed for ages. Proximity is not the whole of law, but it is hard to ignore in the human imagination. So, two stories run alongside each other. One says, a claim was made under a 19th century law, recognised by the United States and followed by administration and occasional enforcement. Therefore the United States speaks for the island. The other says, the island lies in the orbit of Haiti's shores, referenced in Haitian understanding of its own geography, and therefore it should be Haitian. Both sides can point to documents, to maps, to habits of reference. Neither side has persuaded the other to fold its view into a tidy conclusion. Why do such disagreements persist for so long over such a small place? Partly because international disputes are rarely solved by the stopwatch. Even when two capitals enjoy cordial relations, sovereignty is a cornerstone word. No government gives it away lightly, even over a low, stony table in the sea, and partly because the island is uninhabited. There are no voters to petition, no municipal services to deliver, no border guards to deploy, and no daily crisis that forces the pace. In the absence of pressure, diplomacy prefers patience. Positions are stated, restated, and then set down carefully while other business takes precedence. There is also the quiet truth that leaving the disagreement unresolved can be, for long stretches, the least bad option. The hazard to ships is marked on charts. The conservation regime functions without fanfare. The people who most need clarity, the mariners who pass, the scientists who apply for permits, the officers who occasionally check for compliance, already act within a practical framework. Nothing in that framework precludes either country from continuing to press its view at the level of principle. The file remains open, the sea goes on moving. On the ground, and here ground mostly means limestone rim, scrub and permit paperwork, the practical reality is straightforward. The island is managed as part of a national wildlife refuge complex. Public access is closed. Visits are rare and staged with a level of care that would make a watchmaker proud. A small team arrives by vessel in weather that allows it, steps ashore on a narrow window of tide and swell, and gets to work. Tasks might include seabird counts, vegetation plots, invasive plant checks, and maintenance on a few hardy structures that assist with conservation. The aim is to learn enough to protect, and to leave little more than footprints and dust that the wind will erase. Enforcement and safety ride along with that management. The Coast Guard, thinking regionally here, may be called upon to accompany a mission, deter unpermitted landings, or respond to distress if someone tries their luck and comes short. Local fishers in the broader seascape are used to seeing patrols. They're also used to the common sense of staying off a cliffed shore that offers more risk than reward. In a good year, nothing dramatic happens. In a bad weather year, the news, if any, is about storms, not sovereignty. Science provides a neutral bridge. Birds do not carry passports, and coral polyps recognize neither flag. Coordinated efforts to survey seabirds or monitor reefs can include scientists who live in either country or in neither, united by a love of data and a respect for fragile places. Permits and protocols guide the process. Results find their way into reports that inform management plans, and, with luck, help similar islands elsewhere. The information keeps the conservation case grounded in facts rather than in sentiment alone. Nest counts are up or down. Vegetation has crept forward here and retreated there. A heat event left bleaching on these terraces but spared those. This arrangement, clear administration on the calendar of practical matters, continued disagreement in the realm of principle, may look strange from afar, but it has virtues. It lowers the temperature. It allows both narratives to remain intact without inviting confrontation. It delivers what the island most needs: light hands and consistent rules. The lack of a harbour, the surly surge at the base of the cliffs, and the nesting habits of the island's main citizens all argue in the same direction. Keep visits rare, keep noise low, keep the legal fence in good repair even while diplomats, when they wish, discuss whether the fence belongs north or south of a line on a chart. When people talk about sovereignty, they sometimes picture spectacular contests, crowds, flags, speeches, and the sudden stroke of a pen. Most of the time, it is quieter. It is a letter from one ministry to another repeated every few years, a map in a new edition with the same label as the last, a courteous disagreement at a multilateral meeting where everyone knows the script and has other agenda items to get to before lunch. In that long, slow theatre, a small, unpopulated island can carry unresolved status for generations without shaping anyone's daily commute. And yet, clarity matters to those who touch the place. Captains want to know which law applies if something goes wrong. Researchers need to be sure their permits are valid and their data welcome. Enforcement officers need the comfort of standing on a clear chain of authority if they are forced to make decisions under pressure. To those users, the island is not an abstraction. It is a coordinate with real wind and sharp edges. The working answer, administered here, argued over there, serves well enough. Ask again then, whose rock is this? The calm reply is that two countries tell a different story about the same stone. One story is backed by a statute, recognition, and long practice of management. The other by geography, constitutional memory, and a regional sense of belonging. The gap between them has not closed, and it may not close soon. In the meantime, the birds go on schedule in their arrivals. The reef writes its diary in tiny increments. The wind does not pause to read documents. From the perspective of the island itself, the more interesting questions have shifted. Not who holds title, but who holds back. Not which flag flies, but which choices keep cliffs quiet and nests undisturbed. Those are policy problems that can be solved without a treaty. They are solved every season by saying not today to tourism, by making permits few and careful, and by teaching the next generation of mariners to give a narrow shelf and a steep wall the wider berth they deserve. In that sense, the most useful kind of ownership here is stewardship, measured not in declarations but in restraint. It takes a little humility to accept that a small, stubborn island has already answered the question of what it wants from us. It wants distance. It wants predictability. It wants us to keep our admiration mostly to the map. There is nothing mysterious about a closed gate here. It is simply the right tool for the job. The island is managed within the National Wildlife Refuge system, a network built on a modest idea. Some places do their best work for the world when they are left alone. In practical terms, that means visits are by permit only, and those permits exist for narrow purposes: science, stewardship, and the occasional operation that keeps both possible. It is not personal. It is policy tuned to a delicate site and to the lives that depend on quiet. Think of the refuge rules as manners written down. Seabirds require space to court, lay, hatch, and fledge without surprise. Plants on a thin soil plateau grow slowly and resent careless feet. Reptiles, crabs, insects, all the small participants in the island's daily economy, do better when their stage is not rearranged by well-meaning visitors. The system's first question is always the same. Does a proposed visit help the place remain itself? If the answer is no, the answer is also not today. If the answer is yes, approvals come with conditions that read like a checklist for disappearing. Come light, tread lightly, leave lighter. Safety is not an afterthought. It is the other half of the logic. Cliffs here are not scenic backdrops, but literal edges. The shoreline offers almost no natural harbour, just vertical faces, narrow ledges, and the constant hand of surge. A day that looks postcard calm from miles away can be the kind of day that flips a dinghy in a heartbeat at the base of a wave-cut notch. Even professionals plan arrivals like moon landings, study swell period and direction, Scrutinize wind, rehearse retreat. Every extra pair of boots multiplies risk because every person requires a safe step, a safe moment, and a safe exit. The footprint of just visiting is not just a line in the sand. It is a string of exposures for people who will inevitably call for help if luck runs thin. Low disturbance sounds like a whisper, but it is a strategy with teeth. Seabird colonies fail not only from spectacular events, but also from small repeated interruptions. Adults flushed from eggs that overheat in minutes, fledglings spooked into awkward first flights, nests trampled at the edge where vegetation meets rock. On islands with crowds, managers designate trails and build boardwalks to channel curiosity. Here, the best boardwalk is a chart plotter line that stays offshore. When the number of landings approaches zero, the probability of accidental harm heads in the same direction. Permits, when they are granted, translate respect into detail. Team sizes shrink to the minimum that can safely do the work. Timing avoids peak nesting if counts are not the goal. Boots are cleaned before stepping ashore to avoid delivering hitchhiking seeds. Equipment is selected for silence and reliability. The day's plan is sequenced to minimize crisscrossing, one tidy loop rather than a tangle, because every step is a potential disturbance. Water and food come in with the team and go out again, along with every scrap generated. Even data can be gentle. Drones, if used at all, fly high and briefly. Notes replace noise. Some visitors find closure policies stern. A refuge without public trails can feel like a party with the door closed and the music very quiet. But the point is not to scold curiosity. It is to guard what curiosity might unintentionally undo. The list of allowed guests is short on purpose. You could say it is a VIP list where the V stands for very important puffins if there were puffins in the Caribbean. In truth, it stands for their local cousins, boobies, terns, frigate birds and tropic birds, all of them distinguished, all of them busy, none of them improved by flash photography. Closing the gate also reduces the risk of unwelcome introductions. Remote islands can be undone by a single invasive plant or an errant rodent that arrives in a crate. A refuge's best defense is prevention. Fewer landings mean fewer chances for seeds to shake free from treads or for a stowaway to scamper ashore. Where managers do allow a visit, they treat biosecurity as seriously as a pilot treats a pre-flight check. Inspect, seal, re-inspect, and then do the work in as short a window as the sea permits. Economics slips into the logic as well. Search and rescue is costly in money and in danger to responders. A cliff without a harbour turns a minor misjudgment into a major incident. By keeping recreation off the menu, the refuge reduces not only disturbance, but also the frequency of those calls, leaving scarce resources for emergencies that no policy can entirely prevent. Meanwhile, the island continues to deliver value in a different currency. Intact nesting grounds that boost regional seabird populations, and reefs that benefit from light human pressure and thus help seed neighbouring waters. There is also a fairness and consistency. If a place is declared closed, it should genuinely be closed, not closed except for the lucky or well-connected. Clear, simple rules are easier to enforce and to honour. They prevent the slow creep that turns an exception into a custom. Over time, that consistency becomes a kind of culture around a site. Mariners expect to give it a berth. Researchers expect to ask early and prepare well. Photographers expect to use long lenses from a moving platform. The island expects nothing from us at all and receives for once exactly that. The benefits of quiet are not abstract. Nest counts track success. Vegetation plots record the slow strengthening of scrub in places where tramways once ran. Reef surveys document fish that live long enough to grow large and cautious, a sign that the food web has its full cast present. All of this is easier to see and to maintain when the baseline is a lack of commotion. A human love of spectacle is strong. A refuge is how we practice loving subtlety instead. This approach asks a small sacrifice from the rest of us, to trade footprints for imagination. That trade is not as lopsided as it seems. Maps, photographs captured responsibly from the air and sea, and careful storytelling can bring the place to life without putting more pressure on it. Many of the world's most enchanting wildlife sites thrive because most admirers never arrive in person. You can know a lot about a thing by how willing you are to admire it without owning or occupying it. So the closure is not a riddle, it is a reflection of the island's geometry and the birds' calendars. It is about the physics of surge and the ethics of restraint. It is about remembering that our presence is never truly neutral. On a cliffed, harbourless, windy table, the kindest touch is often none at all. If there is a slogan here, it is this: protect the ordinary so it can remain ordinary. A chick begging beneath a high sun, a lizard vanishing into limestone at the rumble of a wave, a shrub adding a hand's breadth of growth in a year. These are not headlines, but they are why refuges exist. Keep the gate closed, keep the rules clear, and the quiet writes its own success. Science arrives the way a careful guest does, only when invited and with clean shoes. Before anyone steps near the island, weeks of planning unfold on maps and weather charts. Permits outline what may be done and what must not be attempted. A small team gathers because small is gentler. A handful of biologists, perhaps a boat crew, sometimes a safety officer. Everyone carries 2 lists, one for what to bring and one for what to leave behind. On the first, soft-soled boots scrubbed of seeds, notebooks, GPS units, calipers, binoculars, a few light cameras, spare batteries, first aid, and water. On the second, anything noisy, anything leaky, anything that could shed burrs or crumbs of plastic, and any plan that would ask the island to bend to human convenience. Timing is the first conservation tool. Visits aim to avoid the most sensitive days of breeding, unless counting nests is exactly the point. Even then, routes are designed to skirt the thickest colonies, and the team moves in a single deliberate line to keep disturbance short and predictable. Landing is rehearsed. One lift to a ledge, then hands steadying gear across the notch, then a quiet pause to read wind and birds before taking a step inland. Everyone speaks in low voices, not because the island cannot tolerate a word, but because calm is contagious. The fieldwork looks simple because simple travels lightly. Seabird counts begin with binocular sweeps and annotated maps. On open ground, observers set slow paces along invisible transects, counting adults on nests, eggs where they can be seen without leaning, and chicks tucked like commas in shade. The method must be repeatable next season. Same route, same width of field, same rules about what qualifies as a nest. In shrub zones, point counts replace lines. The team stands, listens and tallies calls for a set span of minutes. Nothing is moved, nothing is touched unless a protocol demands it, and a permit allows it. The best data are often those gathered at arm's length. Mark Resite helps where species are many and the crowd confused. A subset of birds is banded on trips when permits and conditions permit, with a gentle, practiced hand, a quick capture, a numbered ring, a release into the same air the bird was using a moment ago. Later, observers record which numbers appear and how often, translating sightings into estimates of survival and return. The mathematics happens back on the mainland. The island grants only the few minutes needed for the encounter. Vegetation measurements rely on patience and squares. Light frames, quadrats, are placed at pre-selected waypoints. Within each, the team records what lives there. Percent cover of shrub, grass, bare rock, litter. Photographs capture a consistent view for later comparison, so that a scrub patch becoming denser over 3 years becomes a line on a graph rather than a hunch. Where invasives threaten, search patterns tighten. Boots check likely edges, the old path, the landing shelf, the windward scatter of drift, looking for the telltale leaf or seed head that does not belong. One plant pull today can save 1,000 seedlings next season. One miss today can complicate management for years. Biosecurity is a ritual on arrival and on departure. Brush treads, inspect packs, shake cuffs, seal crates, check again. Reef work is a second, complementary chapter written in salt. When conditions allow, divers lay out transect tapes along consistent depths and count life in bands a set distance wide. Benthic photos frame living coral, algae and rubble, with labels that will match future images to the same rectangles of seafloor. Fish surveys use slow, even fin kicks and eyes tuned to size classes: tiny, small, medium, large. Urchins, where present in meaningful numbers, are recorded because their biting teeth can keep algae in check and give coral room to return after stress. Temperature loggers are strapped to the base of a spur and left for months, quiet witnesses to heat pulses and cool whispers. Back on a desk, their records reveal the curve of a season and the sharp teeth of a heat wave. Sound sometimes tells stories that sight cannot. A small acoustic recorder, the size of a lemon, can sit under a shrub and gather the colony's daily rhythm. When parents trade places, when predators pass, when a squall flattens calls. Another, sealed for immersion, can listen for fish choruses at dusk and for the snaps of pistol shrimp that say something about the health of the reef's smaller residents. These devices do what scientists try to do: be present without being obtrusive and turn moments into lines of data that can be shared and checked. The team's choreography ashore is respectful to the point of self-effacement. Breaks are taken standing rather than sitting, if sitting would flatten a plant. Backpacks are kept off delicate ledges. Lunch waits until the group returns to the boat, because feeding crumbs to the ground is still feeding the ground. Hand sanitizer keeps microbes from travelling. Duct tape collects any fibre that a pocket shed. When a note must be written, someone finds a bare slab and uses it as a desk, then leaves it as blank as before. The day's route always loops in a way that minimises double passing the same nests. Weather remains the head of the table. A wind that freshens 10 knots too far can end a survey halfway, and send the group back to the landing to catch the right rhythm out. A line of squalls reshuffles tasks. Reef work first in clear water, terrestrial counts later when the air steadies, or simply a full retreat with the comfort that coming back safe is a form of data too. Flexibility is not just a virtue, it is a safety measure and a courtesy to birds that do not benefit from an extra hour of human presence. Every field day ends with a small audit. What did we bring? What will we remove? The answer must be the same number in both columns. Gear is counted, trash sealed, digital files checked and backed up. Boots are scrubbed again. Someone looks at the landing ledge to make sure a strap or tag did not catch and stay behind. Then the boat pulls away, taking with it the weight of the visit so the island does not have to carry it. What do these quiet trips produce? They yield time series, the most powerful currency in conservation. A graph of nests year over year tells whether a colony is flourishing or flagging. A plot of coral cover and algal cover moving in opposite directions signals the health of grazers and the shadow of heat stress. A map of invasive detections staying stubbornly empty is a victory worth celebrating in the most modest way, by trying to keep it empty next year too. Reports flow to managers and to the public, so that decisions can be anchored to something sturdier than opinion. There is a second, softer output as well, a culture of humility. People who work this way accept that their role is to watch carefully, change little, and leave the place as close to untouched as possible. The most satisfying sentence in a field log can be the smallest. Completed counts. No disturbance noted. In an age that prizes doing, it is an art to master not doing where not doing is best. All of this, the planning, the light footprints, the devotion to repeatable methods, adds up to a pact between curiosity and care. The island offers its data, not its peace. Scientists take notes, not souvenirs. The reef gives numbers and colour, not coral heads. Everyone leaves a little wiser and a little more convinced that restraint is a form of skill. When the wake smooths and the silhouette shrinks against the horizon, the day's work continues on laptops and in lab benches far away. There, the quiet of the field becomes the clarity of a figure or the firmness of a recommendation. Keep access rare, keep biosecurity strict, keep disturbances brief. In that way, science does not just visit quietly, it returns the favour by arguing for the very rules that made its visit possible. Every archipelago has its quiet corners, and the United States keeps a few so quiet that most maps feel like the only acceptable way to visit. They are distant cousins to our cliff-ringed island, related not by geology, but by the decision to let silence do the heavy lifting. Begin far out in the Central Pacific with Johnston Atoll, a flat, man-made helped speck ringed by a reef that looks like turquoise porcelain from the sky. For much of the 20th century, the atoll was a military outpost and later a place where chemical weapons were destroyed under strict controls. That history wrote a complicated chapter of contamination and cleanup. Today, it sits within a protected marine monument, formerly quiet with access so limited that the reef fish probably think paperwork is a species of plankton. The restrictions here are born of two impulses that, unusually, agree with each other. Keep people safe from what the past left behind, and keep wildlife safe from people. A short leap on the map and you reach Baker Island, a low coral cap near the equator where the wind seldom takes a day off. No permanent residents, no harbour, no freshwater stream, only a runway's ghost from pre-war days, and the tireless company of seabirds. Baker is a national wildlife refuge, wrapped inside a broad marine monument. The rule is simple. Unless you have a permit for conservation or research, you will admire it from the wake of your vessel. On the ground, dry scrub, low dunes, and guano-whitened patches tell a story that moves in tiny increments. Overhead, noddies and boobies supply the soundtrack. Solitude is not a policy here. It is the natural default, merely recognised and defended. Howland Island sits nearby in the same belt of blue, a slightly larger sibling known to many only because of a mystery in the sky in 1937. It is also a refuge, also closed to casual visiting, and also the beneficiary of being inconvenient to land on. The reef rim is a stern teacher, the sun an unrelenting lecturer, and the population a steadfast zero. Birds treat the air as theirs, and they are right. Managers drop in rarely to count nests and check for mishaps. The best measure of success is that every season looks stubbornly like the last. Slide a little to the south and find Jarvis Island, a narrow lens of coral and sand with an interior as bare as a blank page. Jarvis once saw the same guano scraping that turned so many islands into brief workplaces and then, just as quickly, into memories. Now it is strictly a refuge, one of the quietest places the United States administers. The law does not so much close a gate as it labels a sensible reality. There is nowhere to tie up, nowhere to draw water, and nowhere that benefits from footprints. The result is a seabird metropolis with no need for street signs. Turn northwest until you reach Wake Island, a different story entirely. Wake is a strategic atoll with a runway, radars, and a long military history that includes a fierce early battle in the Second World War. The atoll remains under the authority of the United States Air Force and is not open for tourism. Restrictions here speak in the language of operations and security rather than terns and turtle nests, though wildlife has a way of inhabiting edges even where people work. Wake's lesson is that no visitors can arise from a completely separate logic, national defence, yet still produce long stretches of untroubled shoreline where the only regular footprints belong to ghost crabs. Now swing back toward California's coast and stop at San Nicolas Island, one of the outer Channel Islands and for generations a Navy island. Training and testing take precedence. Public access is tightly controlled. The place is famous in the world of literature for the true story that inspired Island of the Blue Dolphins, but the modern reality is a complex choreography of military use and ecological care. The Navy coordinates with biologists to protect pinniped rookeries and fragile plant communities. Here, no visitor doesn't mean no humans ever, but rather humans with a job and a protocol. It is a reminder that restrictions can be sharp-edged and still humane. If you draw a loose circle to include Palmyra Atoll and Kingman Reef, you enlarge the family. Palmyra is co-managed by a conservation group and a federal agency. It allows a thin trickle of permitted scientists and caretakers, and occasionally a very limited number of visitors under strict conditions. Kingman is even quieter, mostly underwater, a reef that treats the surface as a rumour. Both sit within vast protected waters where the main goal is to let large systems breathe. The reasons for silence vary, but they rhyme. Some islands carry the residue of human decisions, fuel, chemicals, unexploded ordnance, so managers keep the curious out for everyone's sake. Others are strict refuges because their value depends on undisturbed cycles, birds that cannot raise chicks in the presence of casual foot traffic, corals that fare better when anchors do not fall on their heads, plants that need wind and salt but not boot treads. Still others are working islands where the work itself requires control. If the world's noisy places are a symphony, these are rests in the score, and the music needs rests as much as it needs trumpets. Remoteness serves as both shield and challenge. Distance lowers temptation and reduces accidental visits. It also increases the cost of caring when care is needed. A grounded vessel on a far reef is harder to rescue, a fuel spill harder to contain, a medical emergency harder to manage. Policies that read strict on paper tend to be practical at sea. The equation is simple. Fewer landings mean fewer chances for things to go sideways. Where landings do occur, they happen under the spell of checklists that border on poetry. Clean every sole, seal every crate, count every item in, count every item out. In each case, conservation benefits not from drama but from reliability. Albatross on one atoll, noddies on another, seals on a third. Each set of animals gets to run its calendar with minimal surprises from us. The reef fish grow up into their adult shapes without an annual run-in with spear guns. Plants complete their slow projects. Data accumulate quietly, and managers begin to think in decades. The natural tempo of places that are both exposed and protected. What ties these sister stories together is not uniform law or matching landscapes, but a shared respect for limits. The reasons for those limits span a spectrum: safety, security, science, and yet they often produce similar results on the ground. Long days when nothing much happens except weather, which is exactly the point. For the human imagination, these islands are generous anyway. They give us a chance to practice a kind of admiration that does not require a rival. They enlarge the meaning of ours to include ours to leave be. Look again at the map with these dots in mind and the ocean changes character. It becomes a gallery with a few paintings marked "Do Not Touch," not because they are fragile in a precious way, but because touching adds nothing to their worth. Each of these sites, Johnston, Baker, Howland, Jarvis, Wake, San Nicolas, tells a slightly different tale, but they all arrive at the same final line. Some places thrive on quiet, and quiet is work. From altitude, the sea stops being a surface and becomes a field of glassy contours, as if someone had breathed gently on silk. The approach begins as a broad arc from the east, where the trade wind lays a neat texture across the water. Swells march in long, patient lines, and a single island interrupts them the way a fingertip interrupts the surface of a drum. Before any rock is visible, colour gives the place away. A pale halo tight around a deeper blue, then a sudden bright ring where waves feather white over the reef crest. The eye follows that necklace, and a small, stark shape resolves at the centre. Limestone lifted into air, edges squared like a table built by time. Patterns at sea are easier to see when you're above them. The reef outlines present themselves as pale, branching avenues that run seaward in regular ribs, the spur and groove architecture spelt out like handwriting. In the grooves, darker channels point downhill. On the spurs, mottled patches show living coral set among scabs of old storm rubble. Where the bottom drops, the colour falls abruptly from turquoise to cobalt, a cliff face in blue rather than stone. Along the rim, the bright fringe of surf repeats itself in a near-perfect loop, dazzling where the sun strikes it, smokier where wind tears the tops off breaking waves and throws a blur of spray downwind. Flight lines are naturally cautious. A first pass runs parallel to the wind, keeping the island on the left so the pilot can look and the camera can drink in the rim without leaning. Then a gentle dogleg sets up a second pass at a different angle, so the reef's geometry is not just seen but felt. The way the swell curves into the corners, the way backwash writes temporary chevrons that slide outward and vanish. A third pass, higher, lets the shadows tell their story. In late afternoon, the cliffs cast long, blue-violet blades that slice inland, revealing the lie of the plateau in reverse. The ground is brighter where it dips and darker where it rises. Shapes that look flat from sea level reveal themselves as a subtle upturned bowl with a rim of notches and a sparse crown of scrub. White water is the island's handwriting. It underlines the most exposed headlands and softens in the lee, though soft is a relative term here. Even in calm weather, the surf draws a continuous pencil line around the rock, narrower on one side, broader and more luminous on the other. When a set arrives, the line brightens and thickens, and the thunder you cannot hear from the window is easy to imagine, because the rhythm is visible. The larger pulses march through in 12s and 13s, lines spaced so evenly that you could tap them on a tabletop, and the island would nod in time. Look closely at the top and you see human geometry fossilized into the landscape. Concrete rectangles mark old footings. The ghost of a pathway shows as a slightly paler ribbon where feet once polished the rock. Most striking is the tower's trace, a steel skeleton that rises and throws a crisp, ruler-straight shadow over a world of curves. The shadow shifts a few degrees with each minute, a sundial for a place without clocks. Nearby, the dark circle of a cistern lid and the neat angles of weathered platforms suggest the former choreography of keepers who once had the horizon for a neighbour and the wind for a companion. The plateau itself reads as a mosaic in muted greens and greys. Low shrubs huddle in hummocks that look like wind-shaped cushions. Bare limestone glints between them as if the sea's foam had dried into stone. In a few sheltered cups, the vegetation deepens to a richer green, small oases where soil is gathered by patience rather than by design. Movement, if you can pick it out from this height, belongs mostly to birds, white slashes of tropic birds looping and tilting in the lift off the cliffs. Dark triangles of frigate birds hung on invisible wires and specks that wheel in tight circles above an unseen nestscape. Farther out, the approach path reveals the island's relationship with distance. A freighter slips along a route that keeps to deep water, a thin wake-like stitching behind it. The ship looks strangely fragile from up here, a toy crossing a table, and the island looks strangely solid, like a single punctuation mark that tells the sentence where to pause. A line of cloud shadow trails over the reef, briefly muting the turquoise and making the white fringe glow even brighter by contrast. Sun returns and the blues sharpen again, cleaner than any painter's palette, because they are made of depth, not pigment. The second circuit takes a wider radius to frame the entire system, the rock, the reef, the deeper plane, and to show how abrupt the transition is. There is no polite shelf where green meets blue. Land stops, water begins, and the argument between them is continuous and cordial and never decided. From above, that argument looks like lace on the hem of a dress being gently shaken. Each scallop is similar to the last and different enough to keep the eye moving. It is tempting to hunt for details, and the air obliges. Look long enough and you notice a lighter patch where storm waves once cleared the top of the reef and left fresh rubble. A darker band offshore marks where the bottom rolls over a terrace. A faint sinuous stain traces where a small current peels away along the lee, pulling a thread of warmer water into cooler. Even the birds write patterns, a commuting line of noddies skimming low, a cluster of boobies circling a patch of ruffled water that probably hides a shoal of bait fish pushed up by something with a bigger mouth. The jet of spray that punches out of a blowhole when the swell meets a tunnel is easy to spot from here, a brief white exclamation point. It arcs, falls, and leaves a ghost of mist that drifts downwind and vanishes. A few seconds later, another plume leaps from a different seam, as if the island were breathing through multiple mouths. The show repeats at intervals that match the longer swell, syncopated by wind chop that adds a sprinkling of glitter to the whole performance. A flyover is not just a vantage, it is a lesson in restraint. There is a reason the window belongs to the camera and the island belongs to the birds. Distance lets the place keep its habits. From up here, the risk and the delicacy of the shoreline become obvious. No harbour, no beach, no margin for error. The air holds you at exactly the right remove to admire without pressing. Care, in this context, is measured in the altitude you maintain and the time you limit. You circle, you look, you learn, and you leave the island as you found it, contained within its bright ring of surf, unruffled by footsteps, and without a new story to recover from. On the final pass, the light leans and the reef returns the favour, reflecting a softer blue. The tower's shadow has slid, the white line around the rock is still writing its patient sentence, and the ship on the horizon is now a smaller assertion moving toward the vanishing point. The plane noses away on a gentle outbound leg, and the island, smaller with each second, grows larger in the mind. You carry a map made of colour and shape and rhythm, a remembered circle of white over turquoise over blue, and a straight shadow cutting across a world of curves, a reminder that some of the best visits are overhead and brief. Islands invite stories, and a lonely one with cliffs and a closed gate invites the dramatic kind. From bar stools to message boards, theories air themselves like laundry on a windy day. Some are charming, some are spooky, and most are a few steps off the ground. A quiet correction or two helps the map match the world. Begin with the favourite, a secret base tucked into caves or under the scrub. Think about the practicalities for 30 seconds. A functioning base needs a way in that does not depend on acrobatics at the foot of a cliff, a steady flow of supplies, power generation, water, waste handling, and people who can come and go without turning heads. Our island has no harbour, no beach, no lagoon, no protected anchorage, and no runway. The near-vertical rim wears a collar of surf that resents ladders. Weather closes approaches on days that look fine from far away. Anything larger than a dinghy must loiter offshore and play a nerve-wracking game with swell and timing. Few secrets survive the parade of barges and cranes that such logistics would require. Satellites, ship trackers, and the eyes of fishers would see the show long before the rumour mill finished warming up. What about drilling into the rock and hiding everything under limestone? The geology is unsentimental. This is uplifted reef, cast riddled with voids and conduits that remember the sea. Caves and blowholes exist, but they are shaped by water and air, not by architects with blueprints. Cut aggressively into such stone and it sheds pieces with enthusiasm. The island rings when the ocean hits it. Tunnels would turn that ring into a drumbeat under your pillow. Engineers understand the difference between a mountain with a granite heart and a plateau made of ancient coral. One is a candidate for deep galleries. The other is a candidate for careful steps and modest expectations. Then there is the old romance of hidden treasure. The phrase has a lovely patina, but treasure needs a past that matches the promise. Pirate coves, merchant caches, galleons dashed in a bay that invites salvage on a good low tide. Our island offers cliffs, surge, and a shoreline that does not hold a small boat in place, let alone a tired crew with chests to bury and maps to draw. The rock is hard, the soil shallow, and the vegetation prickly. In historical terms, the heavy industry here was guano, not gold. If there's treasure, it's calcium carbonate and guano. Bankers remain unmoved. The value that once drew ships came in sacks for fields, not in bars for vaults. Today, the island's wealth is measured in nests and coral heads, which pay out in fish and birds, not in coins. Another popular myth: the island is forbidden because it hides something scandalous. The simpler truth is kinder and a bit humbling. It is restricted because it is fragile and unsafe. Fragile is a biological statement. Seabirds breed on open ground and low shrubs. A few misplaced footsteps can flatten a whole season's work in a few seconds. Adults flushed from nests in midday heat leave eggs that warm quickly past safe limits. Chicks spooked at the wrong age launch into air before feathers are ready. Plants on thin, alkaline soil grow slowly. A boot can erase a year of progress. Reptiles and invertebrates live in microhabitats so small you only learn them by forgetting to stand there twice. Unsafe is a physical statement. Cliffs define the margin. Surge works like a patient hand at the base, changing its grip from minute to minute. There is no cove that forgives a misjudgment. A set of long-period waves can arrive unannounced beneath a surface that looked polite, and one more minute at the landing becomes a rescue narrative. The reason managers keep the public off is not because they suspect you of mischief. It is because gravity, limestone, and ocean energy are not in the mood for negotiation. Professional teams accept these limits and still choose days, gear, and routes that minimize risk. Even they sometimes turn back because the sea has opinions. A cousin to the scandal theory says the closure masks resource extraction, rare metals, secret fisheries, miracle plants. The economics do not add up. Anything mined must be shipped, and the island is allergic to shipping. Anything fished at meaningful scale leaves a paper trail in permits and an unmistakable wake in the water. Miracle plants are wonderful in headlines and stubborn in real life. Botany here is about scrappy shrubs and salt-tolerant herbs, not pharmaceutical orchards. The easier story to believe is the one that fits the geometry. Hard to land, hard to work, easy to damage, valuable when undisturbed. Sometimes the myth is softer, that the island is unused, and thus fair game, a blank page waiting for a better story. The page is not blank. It is already full of writing, just not in our alphabet. The colony schedules its year to the cadence of wind and fish. The reef revises itself with storms and calm spells. The scrub advances a hand's breadth after rain and retreats a little in drought. Our presence is a red ink edit across someone else's careful draft. Choosing not to mark up the page is not waste, it is good reading. There is also the notion that closing a place makes it more alluring and therefore selfish, a gate for the few disguised as a policy for the many. But the rule here is unusually democratic in its strictness. It applies to everyone equally, no tours, no exceptions. The only people who step ashore are those doing tasks that benefit the site itself, counting birds, checking plants, maintaining markers, or responding to an emergency. Even then, the goal is to leave so little trace that, if the wind smoothed out footprints by dusk, the island would not know anyone had come. That is not elitism. It is restraint written into practice. Conspiracies also stumble over the long memory of maps. Charts have labelled this rock as hazardous and harbourless for generations. A lighthouse stood, then automation, then a ruin that still throws a shadow. Legal records documenting administration and refuge status are not secret scrolls. They are boring, public, and often nicely typeset. If someone were hiding something large here, they would have picked a place with a dock, a warehouse, and less paperwork. One more misconception deserves a gentle nudge, that nothing happens there. Quiet does not equal empty. A colony doubling after a few good years is an event, even if no ribbon is cut. A reef that keeps algal films in check because parrotfish can grow old enough to take proper bites is a success, even if nobody notices except the next generation of coral. A year without an invasive plant detection is excellent news, rendered exciting by exactly how unexciting it sounds. Myths cling because they are fun to tell. Corrections stick when they feel like part of a better story. The better story here is not that the island hides something, but that it reveals something. How geography can enforce good manners. How law can recognise a place's character and decide to accommodate it. How leaving space for other lives is a kind of wealth. It asks us to enjoy a different kind of plot, one without the car chase, with a quieter ending, and with more birds in the credits. There is room too for a little self-awareness. Humans love arrival. We like gates that open. We like to stand on edges and say we were there. This island offers a friendly challenge to that habit. Admire me well enough not to insist. It is a test of imagination and patience. Qualities as portable as binoculars and much lighter. You can pass it from a sofa with a map and do less harm than a single careless footprint. So, a few myths set aside, what remains is not disappointment, but a clarifying lens. Secret bases belong to novels with better peers. Treasure chests prefer beaches, not blowholes. Forbidden shrinks to its real size and reads fragile and unsafe. The truth does not need a flourish. It needs a steady voice, a careful look, and the small courage to say that the best use of some places is to let them be. So what does this dot teach geography? Small places bend big lines. A dot of limestone raised from an old reef can change the way charts are drawn, the routes ships choose, the questions scientists ask, and the stories people tell to make sense of coasts and currents. That is the quiet power of micro-territories. They are small in acres and large in consequences. A captain reroutes a freighter by a few miles because a cliff with no harbour draws a warning circle on the electronic chart. A biologist chooses transect lengths to match a reef terrace that narrows suddenly into blue. A lawyer writes a sentence that reaches across water to cover a rock nobody will ever call home. A writer discovers that a single island can carry an entire chapter simply by insisting on being itself. Maps are full of these nudges. The thick lines that mark national borders often trace the edges of large continents, but the hairline threads that separate zones of responsibility at sea can turn on the coordinates of one difficult outcrop. A ring of restricted waters here, a cautionary note there, and the surrounding ocean becomes a mosaic of permissions and warnings. A single dot can justify a lighthouse, a navigation mark, a name in the index, and a paragraph in the pilot book that says, politely, do not improvise near this address. The island does not move, but the lines around it sway in response, like tall grass accommodating a small stubborn stone. Shipping learns from these dots with a practical intelligence. Routes optimize for fuel and time, but prudence makes edits at the margins. A cliffed island with a white fringe teaches the same lesson every day. Keep to depth, respect swell that bends around corners, and do not confuse empty with safe. Across the basin, traffic patterns carry the accumulated memory of such places. Lanes pinch or widen, waypoints drift a little like constellations updated by new observations, and the whole choreography adapts. The island is not hostile, it is simply precise, and precision is contagious in the best possible way. Science, too, appreciates the leverage of smallness. A micro-territory is a laboratory with clean edges. You can count nests across an entire colony because the colony sits on a manageable canvas. You can track how a scrub patch thickens after a few quiet seasons because the patch is the size of a room, not a forest. You can follow the arc of a heat wave in coral cover and fish behaviour with instruments that fit in a backpack. In a big system, signals bury themselves in noise. In a small system, they appear like handwriting on a pale page. The result is not just data for this island, but lessons that travel. The value of low disturbance, the importance of herbivores, the way biosecurity beats cleanup every time. Stories sharpen in small places because edges do. Big landscapes blur. Here, boundaries announce themselves with a thud of surf and a drop of limestone. Edges teach clarity. The cliff is a border that needs no fence. The reef crest is a neighbourhood with rooms, lanes and windows, all visible at a glance if you know how to read water. The plateau's rim says thus far, and the shallow terraces say this way. When centres are small, edges do most of the talking. That does not make the centre less important, it makes the edges more honest. Edges and centres also define how different lives share the same address. For seabirds, the centre is the nest, an exposed scrape or a twiggy platform hidden in low shrubs. For predators, edges are opportunity and patrol route. For corals, the centre is the polyp's tiny circle. For fish, the edges are the ledges and caves that grant refuge and ambush in equal measure. Humans, when we visit, turn the edge into a test. Can we approach without crossing the line from careful to careless? The geography of small things is really a geography of thresholds, and thresholds are where ethics become visible. That ethic begins with a simple proposition. Just because arrival is possible does not mean it is wise. Grace lies in limits, not in their absence. A thriving colony is more valuable than a dozen selfies. A stable reef is worth more than the 5 minutes it would take to stand where it breaks the sea into lace. Restraint is not a scold. It is a craft. It asks for good timing, honest checklists, and the humility to say that admiration from afar can be an action, not a consolation prize. In this frame, leaving a place alone is not doing nothing. It is choosing the thing the place needs most and doing that. Micro-territories also remind us that stewardship can be sharply local without being parochial. The birds that fledge here fish far beyond the white fringe and return seasons later as if guided by a compass older than charts. Larvae spawned on the reef drift into currents that do not carry passports. What happens on a small rock echoes outward into schools, shoals and skies. When managers argue for low disturbance at one coordinate, they are also arguing quietly for the health of waters and wings that cross lines on the map as if they were mist. The law's role, at its best, is to translate the modest wisdom into ordinary rules. Closed to the public is not a drama. It is a line that lets other lines hold. Permits for science and operations-only visits are not gatekeeping for its own sake. They are a way to synchronize human curiosity with nesting seasons and swell periods. The vocabulary is plain: no harbour, steep cliffs, sensitive habitat, and it yields a policy that looks almost like manners made enforceable. Knock rarely, step lightly, bring nothing that breeds, and take nothing that was not yours. There is a grace too in admitting that not every landscape is a stage for us. Some are audiences that listen better without our footsteps. A sofa and a map can be enough. A flyover can be enough. A well-made chart is a form of respect you can hold in your hands. Distance becomes a kind of care when you choose it. It becomes wisdom when you explain it to someone else and they choose it too. The island benefits. The viewer learns patience, and the culture shifts a little toward a kind of default. Small places also train the eye to love detail. After you've learned to see spur and groove patterns from a mile up, coastlines everywhere make more sense. After you have practiced reading the difference between a ledge that invites and a ledge that lies, harbours and headlands tell clearer stories. After you've counted nests in a heat shimmer and written "no disturbance noted" with a tiny surge of pride, ordinary parks and beaches become richer because you notice where not to tread. The geography of small things scales up by teaching attention. And then there is the lesson that limits can be beautiful. Fences painted on water look like wide circles round a dot. Rules written for a rock become sentences about kindness. A warning tower ages into a perch. A cliff that turns visitors away becomes a sanctuary that draws birds in. We often think of freedom as the absence of lines, but on this map the lines are what let life fill the space between them. If a dot of limestone can rearrange routes, write a law into being, host a city of seabirds, and still ask to be left alone, then smallness is not a lack. It is a method. It focuses attention, compresses meaning, and clarifies choices. The world is full of such points, keys, xays, stacks, skerries, that hold more than they seem to in the palm of a hand. To learn from one is to become better at reading all of them, and maybe better at reading the larger world as well. Let the map zoom wide until the island is only a bright ring of foam against the blue. The trade wind keeps its pace, the reef keeps its rooms, the birds keep their appointments. What remains for us is to keep the promise we made when we decided to admire rather than arrive. Soft exhale, sea fades in. Unfold the map one last time in your mind. The Caribbean opens like a blue book, and somewhere between familiar names a small ring of pale stone returns to view. From high above, it is simply shape and colour, white fringe over turquoise over deep cobalt, an island distilled to geometry. Move closer and the rock takes over. A lifted reef, notches cut by waves, a plateau of scrub and heat and wind. Slip beneath the surface and the reef completes the motif with rooms and corridors. Fish drifting through light that looks like water made into glass. Map, rock, reef. 3 ways of seeing the same quiet place, each reminding the others to speak softly. We have traced slow circles tonight. The sea that arrives in patient lines. The limestone that remembers the ocean in its bones. The birds that commute between blue and white, turn in thin soil into nests and nests into flight. Law passed through as well, drawing careful outlines around a dot so that order could reach a place where cliffs resist company. History paused and then kept walking. Industry rose, receded, and left a hush that has become the island's truest sound. It is tempting, always, to ask who a place belongs to. Flags and files try to answer, sometimes crisply, sometimes with half-finished sentences. Belonging in that language is a matter of title and voice. But there is another way to ask the question, and it feels kinder here. What if we put stewardship beside belonging and listen to the difference? Belonging says mine. Stewardship says in my care. Belonging can end a conversation. Stewardship begins one and keeps it gentle. What keeps chicks cool? What keeps ledges unbroken? What keeps the reef breathing through heat and storm? On this island, the better word is the quieter one. Stewardship suits a steep rim and a bright fringe. It admits that the edges are already clear and asks us to admire them rather than redraw them. There is a small grace in limits. Distance is not neglect, it can be a form of affection. A closed gate is not a snub, it is a promise kept on behalf of birds and coral and the careful chemistry of limestone and light. We are very good at arriving. It is worth practicing the other art, the art of staying back and letting a place keep its timetable without our footsteps in the margins. If you carry anything from this journey to your pillow, let it be that. Restraint can be beautiful, and the world is kinder when we remember how to use it. Thank you for drifting here with the Sleepy Geographer this evening. Eyes half closed, thoughts unknotted, listening for the soft facts in a slow story. If this journey felt restful, there are other dots that hum on the map with the same quiet stubbornness. Perhaps next we will visit a lonely atoll in the Central Pacific, where the runway is a memory and the ocean does most of the talking, or a seal-haunted island off California, where cliffs hold both military history and careful protection in the same outline. Different waters, different birds, the same lesson in gentle distance. For now, fold the map. Let the island recede until it is only a thin white circle on blue, then a lighter patch of nothing at all. The wind keeps its appointment with the rim. The surf writes its endless sentence. The reef breathes in colour. Somewhere out there a chick tucks its head beneath a wing and sleeps in a cradle of air and stone. The rest of the world can wait until morning.